More and more begin to know the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Now the Stoics comprised, as did the Epicureans, an enduring school that lasted for centuries. First in Greece and then later in Rome. Their founder was Zeno. This is a different Zeno from the one that couldn't walk across a room, whose dates are 340 to 265 BC, and he had several Greek disciples. I'll mention the names, but I won't bother you with the dates or the spellings because very few people have ever heard of them. Cleanthes, Chrysippus, Posidonius. You can just ignore that. Zeno lectured from a porch, and since the Greek for porch is stoa, he became called the porch philosopher, and thus the word Stoic. In Rome, when the current of civilization shifted there, Stoicism was a highly influential philosophy, much more so than Epicureanism ever became. You've undoubtedly heard of Cicero and Seneca, both of whom, although they're not pure Stoics, are deeply influenced by Stoicism. The two most famous Roman Stoics are Epictetus, the slave, who was born around the mid-1st century AD, and Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, who was 2nd century AD. And it's often said that this indicates the universal appeal of Stoicism in Rome, if a lowly slave and the mighty emperor both were the leading lights in Rome of the same philosophy. Now, because it lasted so many hundreds of years, Stoicism passed through various phases, altering its doctrines in various ways, and it's usual to divide it into early, middle, and late Stoicism, but that is unimportant for our purposes. We will concentrate on some general doctrines common as tendencies and in various forms to most of the Stoics, and we'll particularly interest in the later Stoics as one of the main transitions to Christianity. The early Stoics, I might mention the Greek ones, were materialists in regard to the gods and the soul, somewhat in the manner that the atomists were. But as Stoicism developed, it became progressively more dualistic, more Platonist, more this world versus another world, the soul versus the body, and more emphasizing immortality. That was a progressive tendency in Stoicism. Now the goal of the Stoics was salvation, serenity, peace of mind to the individual in a torn world. They were influenced in this respect not only by the general temper of the times, but also by a particular school which grew out of Socrates' ethical teachings, which I haven't mentioned in this course so far, the school called the Cynics, with a capital C, the most famous of whom, of course, is Diogenes, you know, the one with the lamp that went around looking for an honest man. Socrates had taught, if you recall, that external circumstances cannot harm the really good man. That what counts in life is your internal state, not your external possessions or the circumstances of society. Well, the Cynics proceeded to develop this point beyond anything that Socrates himself had said or implied. They concluded that you should be entirely indifferent to your existential fortune, that you should scorn all social amenities, fancy clothes, material goods, even ordinary civilized manners. Diogenes was in a bathtub out in the street, dressed very sloppily. In effect, go back to nature and live like an animal, like a dog, you see, and thus the name cynic from cynos, which is Greek for dog. Cynic literally means the dog philosopher. And they dressed very shabbily, they scorned all the amenities. They were, in effect, the first hippies in the West. Now, in their desire for peace of mind and their scorn for external things, the Stoics are in part an outgrowth of this earlier cynicism. And in this respect, they are also, of course, similar to Epicurus in their overall thrust of their viewpoint. But they did not believe that Epicurus was independent enough of reality, because he still wanted things from this world. He still wanted pleasure, his garden, his friends, enough wealth for leisure, etc. The Stoic viewpoint was that we must adopt the same general line as Epicurus, but more consistently. More consistently. We must stop valuing anything in the external world or in any way dependent on the external world. We must stop valuing pleasure, so hedonism is out, even the negative hedonism of Epicurus. We must stop valuing friends. We must stop valuing even life, and some of them went so far as to recommend suicide on the grounds that nothing, including life, was of value. But this, I should say, is an extreme viewpoint and did not attract a large posterity. What we must do, they said, is achieve utter insensibility, or as it is in Greek, apathy. That is to say, the absence of feeling, which comes out in English as apathy. Non-emotion. Emotions for them are a disease, an aberration, any emotion as such. And emotions must be obliterated across the board. The ideal Stoic is the man who hears that his wife was just run over, and or that he's just won a $3 million lottery, and or that he just got a new toothbrush with exactly the same reaction. Namely, that's nice or that's too bad, but perfectly calm reaction. They tell the story of Epictetus. I don't know whether it's true, but it illustrates the viewpoint. He was the slave, of course, and that his master was apparently a sadist, and one day was twisting Epicurus, I think it was his leg. And Epictetus is supposed to have said to him very, very calmly, if you continue to twist my leg, your bone is going to break. And the master continued to twist, and at a certain point there was a grinding noise and a crack as the bone broke. And Epictetus is alleged to have looked at him without turning a hair and said, I told you it was going to break. Now, when you reach this stage, you see, nothing in the world can touch you. This is salvation. Now the question is how to achieve this state. And what then should you do once you've reached it? On what basis would you then take any action at all? There could no longer be any advantage to you in seeking any particular goal because you're in a state of apathy, having abandoned all values. Well, the answers to all these questions require us to understand the nature of the universe and see man's place in it. And if you gain this knowledge, you can attain apathy and know on what basis to act. So we turn then to the Stoic view of the nature of the universe. In other words, the metaphysics of the Stoics.
what can the United States do short of the type of phone call you mentioned to keep the Israeli military within the confines of its ability to defend Israel under international law? Stated differently, to stop the slaughter.
Yeah, no, I don't. Unless we cut off the aid, or unless we start agreeing at the UN Security Council that there needs to be a permanent ceasefire. Unless we reverse our position, this is going to continue. This is not going to stop. Israel is not going to stop. They have, the images we keep seeing of them. They shot and killed an elderly deaf guy the other day. He was waving his hands because he couldn't communicate. I mean, he couldn't talk, and they shot him. He was unarmed, and they were laughing about it later. The soldiers were laughing about it. So the images of the children who's have seen their parents shot and murdered, unarmed people all the time being shot. The bombs going off. I mean, it's sickening. It's horrifying. But
this reminds me of some of the revelations of Julian Assange, of American drone operators laughing when their drones killed civilians in Afghanistan.
Yeah, the Israelis didn't learn a damn thing from Abu Ghraib. You think after Abu Ghraib that people learn, hey, you got social media, you got these camera phones, don't take pictures, don't take videos, don't record it. Not only do they record it, they then post it. It gets posted on social media because they're proud of it. So, and this is taking place on a scale that surpasses anything that the United States did in Iraq to civilians. It's on just an entirely new scale. So the world sits back and watches in horror, and we're still faced with there's only one country actually doing something, trying to stop it, and that's Yemen with the Houthis.
Right. And Mike Pompeo, we now know why he was dancing with the IDF. He said over the weekend he'd love to go back to being Secretary of State under a second Trump presidency, and probably whoever controls the Senate, it's the war party, so it doesn't matter if Chuck Schumer's the leader of the Senate or whoever's going to replace Mitch McConnell. They'll confirm a person with that mentality and that attitude.
Yeah, no doubt. But at some point the United States is going to have a cold wake up call. Reality is going to intrude. I think that will come first via Ukraine, and the likely scenario is that as Ukraine is starting to collapse, the United States will try to intervene militarily. And in the process, we're going to suffer some grievous losses. And it's when you start losing, and when you have people being killed and you're losing, key military equipment, all of a sudden you wake up and go, well, wait a second, I thought we had the best military in the world. Instead, it turns out, as we've said many times, we got the most expensive, not necessarily the best.
Ray McGovern says that Biden's going to be confronted with a choice of troops or nukes because he's got to keep the war going with the illusion of victory coming before Election Day.
Well, we hope certainly hope it's not the latter. Yeah, because the United States would wind up on the, we would lose that confrontation for this reason. Russia has developed ballistic missile defense systems. It's not to say that 100%. It's not to say that 1 or 2 U.S. nukes would get through and would kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Russians. But Russia as a country, both by virtue of its vast size and its dispersal of population, would survive such an encounter. The United States would not. And, the need for cooler heads for some adults to step up and say, look, wait a second. We don't need to be into this life and death struggle with the Russians, or for that matter, the Chinese. We need to find out a way that we can actually live together, work together on common issues of common interest without killing each other. But if you step back and objectively look at the behavior of the United States, most of my adult life, going back to, it's been war. And we celebrate going to everything from small, like going into Grenada or invading Panama, or bigger, Iraq twice, Syria, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Serbia, the list goes on. And at some point, Americans need to step back and say, wait a second, what is it that we're about? We're not spreading democracy. We're spreading death and destruction.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Next up, House panel unanimously approves bill that could ban TikTok. Because, We can't have China feeding our kids all sorts of crap and taking their data. That's what we got to do. We need to control the crap that our kids are seeing online and the data that we're able to take from them. I like this, though, because you know what? I became libertarian leaning all the way back in high school when I was smoking weed, and you realize government's not your friend. You're like, I don't understand. I hate school and I love this weed. And now you're telling me that I could go to jail for this plant that makes everything that's bad feel all right? I don't feel this way anymore. I don't smoke weed like I did back in high school. But back in high school, when you found the one thing you loved in life and government was telling you you were a criminal for it when you weren't harming anyone else, you kind of realized, oh, these people aren't my friend. They're not doing me any favors. And so you take TikTok away from all these kids. You know, and who knows, maybe 10 years later, they turn around and they realize that all the crap that they were consuming on TikTok and all the thing that China was convincing them of, taking Tide Pods, trying to become trans, praising Dylan Mulvaney, who knows? Maybe they'll all turn around and go, Big Brother really saved me. But I bet in the meantime, you're actually going to wake a generation of kids up to, hey, what do you guys, why are you taking away this thing that I like? I like sitting passively, scrolling endlessly, and watching stupid shit, and you're going to take it from me? And now, obviously, the problem here is every time they talk about, well, you know, the data is dangerous, all the data that they can accumulate is dangerous, the things that they would know, aren't you also showing your cards of what you guys are doing? I mean, why is it that all the companies that you guys work with and you buy data from, we shouldn't be, because governments are, right, because you guys do it. When you're doing it, it's all in our interest. When it's another government that's doing it, it's not. And to what extent does this just favor Facebook and Instagram, who appear more willing? Well, I get, TikTok even censored even more. And then the next one is I always like showcasing the government regulations that I think really hinder economic growth. And we've also talked about when you had your whole racket of the BlackRocks, the ESG scores, and people trying to say that the Fed should also take green energy into account. Their mandate shouldn't just be a dual mandate of employment and inflation. They should also think about the environment. And so forget whether or not people, you know what, maybe what we should do is have 10% unemployment, but, less damage to the environment. Maybe that's the way the Fed should start thinking about things. It's not just about employment and inflation, but it's also, are we preserving the environment? And who knows what that means, or whether or not if we even shut down all industry in this country, if it would make any difference in terms of carbon creation in the sky, and with China and India not just creating more factories and then polluting even more to sell us stuff that we just can't make over here. But guys, it's all in the name of the environment. So anyways, this was from the Wall Street Journal, and it's exploring the SEC regulations that basically companies have to self-report on their, basically how, we're going to read it, maybe I don't have my summary right, but basically how their activities will affect the environment. Two problems with this. One, it creates a framework by which in the future, I guess they could further regulate these companies and further regulate, what they're doing. And two, it takes brain power away from economic growth, growing your company, trying to actually have value and profits, and puts it towards a new form of regulation where not only do you have to run your stress test or this or that to make sure that you're solvent and self-reporting to the government, but you're also responsible for your own. It's like the government wants to regulate you, but you have to do your own homework for it. You have to actually sit down and self-incriminate yourself and hand over the records of what you're doing. It's not even government's obligation to go and do that. All right, let's give it a read. The SEC's political climate control. Securities and Exchange Commissioner Chair Gary Gensler on Wednesday released his regulatory magnum opus, an 886-page climate disclosure rule, calling an election year gift to class action attorney and a financial stimulus for auditors. Progressives have lobbied the SEC to require public companies to make detailed disclosures of their climate-related risks and CO2 emissions. Mr. Gensler obliged. The rule exceeds the agency's authority under the law and imposes new costs on public companies, even if it doesn't go as far as some of Mr. Gensler's friends on the left want. The rules force public companies to report how they assess and manage climate-related risks, including the risks from the government-imposed green transition. Transition risks are broadly defined to include climate-related changes in law or policy, reduced market demand for carbon-intensive products, the devaluation of abandonment of assets, risks of legal liability and litigation defense costs, competitive pressures associated with adoption of new technologies, reputational impacts, and more. In short, companies will have to project hypothetical changes in government climate policies and market demand, no matter how improbable, and explain how they are managing such risks. What about the risk that consumers don't warm to electric vehicles, that governments are forcing automakers to produce, or that climate policies are scaled back as they have been in Europe? Companies won't have to explain how they're managing the more tangible risks. Companies will also have to document spending on climate-related effects and mitigation, including carbon offset to comply with voluntary goals and government regulation. Businesses don't currently. All right, we're going to stop there. You guys can read the rest of this article, but showcasing once again government regulation that instead of just being able to run a business, try and create products that consumers actually want, creating them at better value than your competition so you can grow your market share, create more capital, and then invest in other things that you think consumers will want and do it better than your competition. You have to sit down and try and figure out what businesses the government will actually, it's not about the products or services consumers might want. It's about making investments now in products or services that the government might let you sell, or it might just change the laws in 2 years or give up on some sort of initiative. And then all of a sudden you're losing money because you thought that you were doing something that government regulations were going to make profitable. All right.
Dickinson. Now, Dickinson, again, he was the penman of the American Revolution, probably the most important writer in that time. And, 1764 through 1767 or so, he was really churning out really popular stuff. But this was kind of the basis of much of the revolutionary thought. And here he is being cited by the Anti-Federalists in 1787. Now, Dickinson was not an Anti-Federalist in 1787, although he was the primary author of, or I call him the father of the Articles of Confederation. He was in support of ratification at that point, but we should actually cover his papers in support because they're a very, very interesting take as well. But here he is talking about, he's citing John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767, which said this, quote, "A perpetual jealousy respecting liberty is absolutely requisite in all free states. The very texture of their constitution in mixed governments demands it." In other words, what Dickinson is saying, if you see anything that might be encroaching upon liberty, you have to be all over this. This is perpetual jealousy means a really, really watchful eye and action about that. And the federal farmer is telling us, look, hey, if you think that it's not good now, why would we abandon this principle of perpetual jealousy and just accept it? And with a promise that everything's going to be cool later on. He opposed that. Now, Patrick Henry was not a fan, and I don't think Richard Henry Lee was either of what they came up with the Bill of Rights, but so, that's another story for another day. But going further, here's Dickinson. "When an act injurious to freedom has been once done, and the people bear it, the repetition of it is most likely to meet with submission." So once they get the ball rolling, what he called in response to the Stamp Act, the detestable precedent, doesn't matter how small the precedent may be, once the people put up with it, it's going to result in over time submission. And we see that certainly all the time today. "For as the mischief," he said, "of the one was found to be tolerable, they will hope that of the second will prove so too, and they will not regard the infamy of the last because they are stained with that of the first." I think it's a really good description of what we live under today. That's John Dickinson in 1767. And here's how the federal farmer wraps up his fourth paper. He said, "However, if our countrymen are so soon changed, and the language of 1774 is become odious to them. We often think of the spirit of 1776, but the spirit of 1774, I know Mike Meharry is on pause right now, but he's been working on a bunch of essays that we're turning into a short handbook about the way that what was going on in 1774, the ramp up of the opposition to centralized power that I think is going to be really interesting. And here's the federal farmer saying, if we've given up these views of 1774, the really, really strong revolutionary principles, he said, if that's become odious to them, it will be in vain to use the language of freedom or attempt to rouse them to free inquiries. But I shall never believe this is the case with them, whatever present appearances may be, till I shall have very strong evidence indeed of it. And that's the end of Federal Farmer number 4. And then going right to his 5th paper, he goes right into this again. He said, instead of seeing powers cautiously lodged in the hands of numerous legislators and many magistrates, he wanted a large representation. So many of the Anti-Federalists thought it was impossible to have representation. If you think about this logically, if you have one even in 30,000, I don't know what the numbers are today, but it's nowhere close to that. 700,000, something like that. Someone would know probably in the chat better than me. But if you have one person trying to represent the views of really technically even 2 people, it's technically impossible to represent their views unless they happen to think exactly the same. But if you really expand that, now that becomes kind of unwieldy, I guess, but if you expand that to 30,000 or 50,000 or hundreds of thousands, these people aren't representatives. They're rulers, really. And that's what they're called by so many of the founders. So instead of seeing powers cautiously lodged in numerous legislators, we see all important powers collecting in one center, where a few men will possess them almost at discretion. And again, he's talking about how these are undefined. Federal Farmer is not arguing, as can be seen in how he responded to James Wilson. He's not arguing that the Constitution was not set up as something of delegated and reserved powers. He's like, well, it's just a matter of who has the power. They're going to read it in the way that they want to read it. And that certainly is what they do constantly today. And as long as you rely on going back to them, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. He said, we are to understand the equal division of lands among our people. I actually don't know what that's referencing, but this one I do. And the strong arm furnished them by nature and situation are to secure them against those usurpations. Over and over and over, the Federalists told us, whether it's James Iredell in North Carolina, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Roger Sherman, John Dickinson, and so many others, they told us over and over and over, basically a version of the people will resist if the government usurps power not delegated to it, basically steals power that it's not authorized to use. that it's going to be up to the people to keep them in check. And this is how I describe the unwritten enforcement mechanism of the Constitution, because that's what was sold to the people and that's what was approved in the ratification documents. But the federal farmer did not like that. He acknowledged that that was the situation, that we have to have the strong arm furnish them by nature and situation to actually deal with usurpations. He's like, this is troublesome. He said, no man of reflection and skilled in the science of government can suppose that these will move on harmoniously together for ages or even for 50 years. So he's telling us that not even 50 years are we going to see the people enforce the Constitution. And maybe it really only lasted, I don't know, depending on who you talk to. For me, it's like 2 years before we got the bank in 1791, maybe 1789 as well.
Recently, the Biden administration attempted to split Netanyahu's policies from the overall sentiments of the Israeli people. During his MSNBC interviews, Biden charged that Netanyahu was harming Israel. Netanyahu rebuked Biden, claiming his policies were widely accepted by Israelis. And here's Netanyahu's quote: "The positions that I espouse are supported by the overwhelming majority of Israelis who say to you after October 7th, he said. So essentially, he's right. The Israeli sentiment is in favor of this continuing war. And so Netanyahu, of course, is facing possible prison. So he doesn't want the war to go over either, because when war's ended, you know, people are going to look around and say, this is the guy who was corruption, et cetera, et cetera.
You know, television claims it's military action or a defensive response to Hamas attack on October 7th. We'll go there. We're not going to leave. You know, I have a red line, you know, that threat there. But so what else should our answer be? Because these people are going to be fighting. They have been, and they don't make much progress. Why couldn't they say, okay, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead if that's what you have to do. And there's been times when Israel did some things for their true defense, when they thought for their survival they could do it. And I wasn't strongly critical of them saying they were creating the war. This is a little bit different than Israel, securing their borders. But this is something that has been going on, and it's not new. It's not different. It's part of human nature, but it's part of governments that get involved and that want to be everything to everybody. And the people who they really pay attention to are the people who have money. Then both sides get money, and then both sides have factions. And then the last thing you have is a true republic. You have the fight for who's going to run the dictatorship of the majority. And then and for that reason, it's natural that they'll be involved in elections. You know, to make sure these factions are taken care of, and they want to change all the rules. So and it's been progressing. The place where we've been more optimistic, there are more people waking up, more people are concerned. They stood up to COVID, and the knowledge is there, except the enemy is so powerful and monolithic when you look at so much of the control of the economy and the control of the media, especially social media. That is very, very powerful. The institutions of learning, you know, they've been preaching all this stuff too. That's why, you know, even if we could turn the switch off, it probably takes a generation, because we've had a couple generations, you know, that have graduated with nothing but this nonsense pumped into their brain. And so it's going to take it. But most people think, oh, well, we'll have to have a civil war or something like that. We don't have to. We have to have a contest of ideas. And if our ideas are superior, they should reign, as long as we get that message to the people.
So they dropped from parachutes a bunch of meals, and they killed a bunch of Palestinians with the stupid meals. The airdrop to Gaza kills 5 Palestinians after the parachutes fail. Can you imagine running out to get food after starving? Golly. The parachute breaks and kills you. So what does Biden come up with? He says, well, I got a great idea. He said it in his State of the Union. We're going to build a pier. We're going to build a temporary port in Gaza to deliver the aid, because killing people with food meals is probably not a great idea. So what does that mean? Put this next one up. This is Military Times. That means you're going to deploy 1,000 U.S. troops. The Military Times reports on Friday, 1,000 U.S. troops deployed to build offshore port for Gaza aid. Now, Biden said no troops on the ground. I guess they'll just be standing on that port trying to build it. The question being, well, hang on a minute. We give Israel all these bombs. We give them all the money. And then we want to bring some food into starving people. They say no. And we say, okay, you know, we don't want to bother you. So we're going to build this port. But the clincher on this one is, and this is Kyle Enslow from the Libertarian Institute, as he tweeted a couple of days ago or yesterday, the Biden's Gaza seaport will take months to establish. So this is basically a jobs program for the military. If you are starving today, you're not going to be better off in months when they have this thing built.
You know, the authoritarians might not plan every detail, but when a detail pops up and there's an opening for them, they jump in and make use of it to try to promote their cause. But I think one thing that a lot of people get disgusted with is the obsession and the absolute refusal. We don't want to talk to anybody. We are done talking, and we're going to fight till the last person that we need to kill. I think that it's even if they were fibbing a little, you'd think this doesn't make any sense. But they're telling the truth, and of course I think that solidifies the fact that there is going to be no peace there, and at the rate we're going. And I guess that it'll happen when both sides run out of ammunition. But as long as we support one side and pretend we support the other side, there's going to be a lot of ammunition for a long time. Yeah. And there will be a side that's victorious, but the resentment will just increase. Yeah. There's liable to be more enemies on the side of the Palestinians as time goes on. If they get wiped off all their territory, and of course it's been the settlements that's been the sore spot anyway, and now we can settle any place we went in the whole Middle East. Palestine is dead. Dead and gone, and that's going to stir up some people who've been very neutral. And of course, when it talks about where you should go and what you should do, in many ways, very neutral. If there are two people fighting, to pretend that we know which one happened, which one are the good guys, what we do is we end up sending stuff to both sides. Yeah. So it makes no sense, and that's why a bankruptcy, maybe some good could come from it. But right now, all we're doing is consuming wealth and destroying the freedom of. I talk a lot about the freedoms in this country, but I think it's going to be the freedoms much more diverse than that. It's going to be anybody involved. I mean, the people in the Middle East, they don't have much freedom now. How about Ukraine? Yeah. The people who didn't want to take on Russia or something like that. They are destined to have lost so much, and it continues. So war is not a good idea, and the people who promote it are doing it for very, very self reasons, not for building a republic and promoting individual liberty.
Now, Epicurus is a development from atomism. Stoicism is a development from Platonism. And the best way to approach their metaphysics is via the argument from design, as it's called, design. A venerable argument for the existence of God on which the metaphysics of the Stoics ultimately rests. This argument was not originated by the Stoics. It goes back all the way to Anaxagoras, you remember the man with the little seeds? And of course it's in many, many places implied, all but explicitly stated in Plato himself. But the Stoics are the first school to make this argument fundamental to their metaphysics. The argument from design goes like this. Look at the universe. Look how orderly, lawful, regular it is. Look how complex, and yet look at the magnificent harmony of all of the various parts, all fitting into a smoothly functioning whole. Look at the purposiveness of all the parts, all meshing together to achieve an overall design. Now, such obvious perfection and design in the universe implies a designer, a powerful cosmic soul or intelligence which runs the universe for some ultimate purpose, which keeps all things orderly and lawful as a part of its purpose. And therefore, there must be such a cosmic intelligence, namely God. That's the argument in design. Now, I assume I interject here that you know the error of this argument. In essence, it assumes that existence left to its own devices, in the absence of a designing mind, would run wild and become chaos. In other words, the argument fails to recognize that order, a law, a regularity means the law of cause and effect. Now, the law of cause and effect is simply a corollary of the law of identity, which is inherent in existence as such. And therefore, there's no such thing as a possibility of a disorderly existence, metaphysically. And consequently, there is no need for a God to keep existence in line. A as A is quite sufficient. As to the idea that everything has a purpose, which is a different concept from everything obeys law, you may ask, what was the Stoic reasoning behind this? In general, as derivative philosophers, the Stoics simply accepted the overall teleological viewpoint of Plato and Aristotle. And of course, purpose does imply some sort of conscious agent which has the purpose. It's a very different concept from law, which does not imply a conscious agent. And that is why the argument from design is frequently called the teleological argument for the existence of God, from telos, the Greek for purpose. This argument, I may say, appears in the Reader's Digest every 6 months or a year under the title 12 Reasons Why a Scientist Believes in God. In any case, the Stoics accepted this argument as proof of God. They did not, however, believe that God is a being existing separately in another world, in another dimension, the way we're accustomed to think of God from the point of view of Judaism or Christianity. They took instead the analogy to the human body, the human being. Just as the soul of the human being is not outside the body, controlling it from another realm, but is within the body, controlling it from inside and making its behavior ordered. So they said with the universe as a whole. God, the controlling agent of the universe, is also within the universe. We should think of him as the soul of the universe as a whole, the world soul, you see, and forming with the matter of the universe a single cosmic living being, a single indivisible entity. Now, you see, this is essentially the standard religious viewpoint, but the attempt to give a more naturalistic account of God, trying to base the view of the God's relation to the world on the model of the soul-body relation, which we can directly observe here on Earth. Now, this sort of view is called pantheism, from the Greek pan meaning all and theos, God. The universe as a whole is matter infused with a semi-personal, omnipresent mind or soul guiding everything for the best. And that totality is, they sometimes refer to it as the cosmic animal. And they give it a whole bunch of different names. Sometimes they call it God, or nature, or Zeus, or reason, or providence. There's a whole string of names. Now, two attributes of this animal, that is to say of the universe or of God, whatever you want to call it, should be noted here. First, as already suggested, it is teleological through and through. Everything happens for the best, for a purpose of God's. This is inherent in the argument from design. The world is designed and kept orderly by God for some purpose or goal of his. And of course, this point, as I suggested, the Stoics generally took over the overall teleology from Plato and Aristotle. I should say, though, that the Stoic teleology tended to be much cruder than either Plato's or Aristotle's. Plato had his comparatively sophisticated form of the good, toward which everything aspires. And Aristotle had his metaphysical self-realizationism. For the Stoics, however, generally they had an anthropomorphic view of teleology. In other words, the purpose of everything, many of them said, at least part of the time, was somehow man's welfare. So, for instance, you get the kind of, crude, low-level teleology. Why are there diseases? To combat population growth. Why are there bed bugs? To get us up in the morning. Why do melon have ribs? So we can apportion the shares equally, etc. Now, this is what you call a primitive teleology.
Last week, President Biden delivered a dark and angry speech meant to convince the low percentage of Americans who still feel positive about his presidency that everything is fine and will only get better if he is reelected for a second term. Unfortunately, we have come a long way from the optimism of a Ronald Reagan, who won a second term partially on the popularity of his Morning in America campaign in commercials. Reagan was far from a perfect president, but it was that sense of optimism in otherwise difficult times that resulted in a record re-election victory. Biden's speech, by contrast, was dark and angry, attacking not only his political opponents, but even seeming to threaten the Supreme Court. As constitutional law professor Jonathan Turley observed recently, in some ways the State of the Union speech may have died when former Speaker Nancy Pelosi ripped up the address of former President Donald Trump. While many in the media celebrated her lack of decorum and respect, she tore up something far more important than a speech. She shredded decades of traditions of civility and any remaining residue of restraint in our politics. We seem to be becoming a nation that would rather scream at each other than listen to each other. The message of Biden's speech was that if you do not support the re-election of Joe Biden, you are an insurrectionist and hate America and democracy. 7 years after the launch of the Russiagate hoax against then-candidate Donald Trump, it becomes clearer that the line "our democracy" means is only democratic when their side gets elected. It's understandable that Biden is so angry. Despite all the lying with statistics about the economy, Americans can clearly see for themselves how inflation is undermining the standard of living. Of course, this is not all Biden's fault. Republicans in control of the House show little interest in really cutting spending, but people generally blame the president of the state of the economy. We are no better off on foreign policy either. President Biden started his speech by comparing Russian President Vladimir Putin with Hitler, claiming that Putin is on the march in Europe, just as Hitler was in 1941. And that's just as in those days. If he is not stopped in Ukraine, he will continue to rampage through the continent. It was blatant fear-mongering based on no evidence. In fact, as Putin told Tucker Carlson just weeks ago, he has no interest in taking the war beyond Ukraine. But Biden is determined to spend another $61 billion on the failed proxy war in Ukraine, and he is willing to say whatever he feels necessary to get that money. Biden also introduced a bizarre plan to build a temporary pier on the shores of Gaza so that the U.S. could deliver aid to starving Palestinians. Considering the billions of dollars and tens of thousands of missiles we have shipped to Israel, wouldn't it just be easier to inform the Israel Prime Minister that we would either be delivering aid to Palestinians over land or else? In all, Biden's final State of the Union before the election reveals a president and administration that is out of gas and out of ideas. It also reveals a country deep in bankruptcy, both moral and economic. It is high time for a nationwide movement toward liberty. Thanks for listening.
So an annual threat assessment compiled by U.S. intelligence agencies was released on Monday and said that Israel will likely face resistance from Hamas for years to come. And this is just more evidence that Netanyahu's stated goal of eradicating Hamas is not realistic. So this threat assessment, again, this is compiled by all the U.S. intel agencies. It says, quote, Israel probably will face lingering armed resistance from Hamas for years to come, and the military will struggle to neutralize Hamas's underground infrastructure, which allows insurgents to hide, regain strength, and surprise Israeli forces, end quote. So this assessment actually aligns with an Israeli military document that was circulated last month and said even if Israel succeeded in dismantling Hamas as an organized military force, the group would still exist as a terror group and a guerrilla group. Other reports have said Israel is struggling to destroy the vast tunnel network underneath Gaza that is key to Hamas's survival and is far more expansive than Israel initially thought. So the threat assessment did say that as well, that dismantling their underground infrastructure will be a challenge. And so I mentioned, I mentioned again something I covered a few months ago, that General Charles Q. Brown, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking U.S. military officer, he said back in November that the Israel's mass killing of civilians in Gaza will be a recruiting tool for Hamas. And he was saying that, you got to end hostilities. He said, quote, the faster you can get to a point where you stop the hostilities, you have less strife for the civilian population that turns into someone who now wants to be the next member of Hamas, end quote. So look at all this evidence, U.S. intelligence basically saying Hamas can't be defeated. You have Israeli military intelligence saying the same thing. That's the highest ranking U.S. military officer warning that Israel's tactics are just going to, create more Hamas fighters, but it doesn't matter. The U.S. still continues to provide unconditional aid for the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. The death toll, according to Gaza's health ministry, is now over 31,000. That's considered to be an undercount. I mean, it must be an undercount because they're not taking into counting the thousands of people who are under the rubble. There was some interesting stuff about Iran. It said that Iran had no role in Hamas's October 7th attack. And it also acknowledged that Tehran is not seeking a nuclear weapon. And it also said that Iran's increase in uranium enrichment since 2018 really started in 2019. They waited a year before they started increasing things. But since 2018, when the U.S. pulled out of the nuclear deal, it acknowledges that is all to build negotiating leverage, which is very obvious to anyone who understands what's going on with Iran. But those increases in enrichment are always used for the scaremongering that Iran's trying to build a nuclear weapon. So it's interesting to see U.S. intelligence say it's just for leverage for negotiations. So Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski confirmed in comments on Friday that NATO troops are inside Ukraine, but he would not name the countries who have personnel on the ground. Sikorski said, quote, NATO soldiers are present in Ukraine, and I would like to thank the ambassadors of those countries who have taken that risk. These countries know who they are, but I can't disclose them. Contrary to other politicians, I will not list those countries, end quote. So the fact that NATO troops are in Ukraine is an open secret. We know this, especially if you listen to the show, because I've been talking about it a lot lately, that the Discord leaks revealed last year that as of March 2023, there were 97 NATO Special Operations soldiers in the country. So a very small presence, but NATO troops on the ground nonetheless. And of course, this risks escalation and a direct war with Russia. And this issue has gotten much more attention since Macron, the French president, said recently that NATO has not ruled out the idea of sending troops. So in response to Sikorski's comments, Russia said, that there's no point in NATO continuing to claim that they don't have troops inside Ukraine because of these comments and other comments recently about that fact. There's also that leaked recording of German military officers that revealed British soldiers inside Ukraine are helping Ukrainian forces fire Storm Shadow missiles, which have a range of about 150 miles. So if this name, Sikorski, I believe I'm saying that right, Sikorski sounds familiar, that's because he was the Polish official. At the time, he was a member of the European Parliament. Now he's the foreign minister. And I believe he was the foreign minister and defense minister in previous governments. The day that the Nord Stream pipelines blew up, he was the one that tweeted a picture of it and said, "Thank you, USA." So he's the one that first pointed the finger at the U.S. And he deleted that tweet after a few days. And another interesting fact about this guy is that he's married to Anne Applebaum, who's an American writer, neocon, total neocon. I think she's at The Atlantic now. But he's definitely an interesting character. This is an article from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute, and it says, for years, several federal agencies have been spending U.S. tax dollars to buy Americans' data from private bulk sellers. As some members of Congress seek a new law against the practice, the Joe Biden administration is pushing back on the effort to curtail the power to buy the information that would otherwise require a warrant. So this is U.S. intelligence, military, and law enforcement agencies. They have gathered massive amounts of Americans' data through these private brokers, basically data that they collect from you while you're on the phone, on the computer, doing whatever. They sell to the government, and they don't need any sort of warrant or anything. So it's very intrusive. It's a very intrusive thing. So a bipartisan group of lawmakers has teamed up to stop the unconstitutional method of collecting massive amounts of Americans' information. And they introduced this bill that would prohibit the government from buying this stuff, although it would allow for the collection of data on foreign nationals, which that also would probably leave open some sort of loophole, to also collect stuff on Americans. But anyway, at least it's something here. And the White House is working against this and saying that they oppose this. So that's not really a surprise, but something so blatant for the White House to come out against it or in support of this sort of data harvesting.
Aren't there American troops in Ukraine just out of uniform? Certainly American intel is there, and American contractors there, and American soldiers of fortune are there. But are active duty troops, Army, Marines, on the ground in Ukraine?
Yes, there's active duty troops on the ground in Ukraine, hundreds of them. They're not informal conventional combat units. They might be in an advisory capacity. They might be there for logistics purposes, for accounting purposes. There's teams of military people who are running around trying to keep track of these weapons, but there's definitely Americans on the ground. But here's the other thing I just think your audience needs to be reminded of. The 1948 legislation that created that transformed the military into a joint, this joint concept of military operations that created the CIA and created the National Security Council. There's important language in there about the role of the National Security Council, which is, of course, a body that has no congressional oversight. And it talks about the fact that they can run a secret foreign policy. They can do things that are covert in nature, non-reportable to the American people, non-reportable to Congress. They can lie, they can cheat, they can steal, that Americans can have diplomats saying one thing while the CIA is doing another thing altogether. And that's just the way it is. So when the President of the United States, and this is the disturbing thing about that, when the President of the United States is speaking to the American people in the State of the Union, just saying something, understand that it's likely that he's lying to the American people, because we have secret foreign policy. And in Ukraine, we've never told the American public the truth. I mean, imagine what the discussion would have been in 2021 when we were talking about Russian troop movement, if the American people knew that the CIA since 2014 had 12 bases along the Ukrainian border collecting intelligence for potential offensive strikes inside Russia. Imagine what the debate would be if we'd been informed of that. Instead, we're told, no, we're doing nothing. Those Russians are being aggressive. Those Russians, we haven't provoked the Russians. We do nothing but provoke them. And here's the other thing. The president may be able to lie to the American people. The Russians know darn well what's going on. They knew those 12 bases were there. They know what the American policy is, and that's why they act the way they do. It would be nice if we would just as a nation decide that we don't want a CIA that carries out covert foreign policies, that for once the American government, who reports to us, by the way, we the people, of the people, by the people, for the people, that's what I heard Abraham Lincoln say, that we actually are in charge. But what it is, we're dupes. We are literally dupes who elect a government who is allowed by law to lie to us, to carry out covert policy, to deny it to Congress. It's all deniable. And they're doing it over and over again. American ambassadors who work in the embassies across this country are not the number one voice of the American people. It's the CIA station chief.
The last president that tried to stop the CIA operations from overthrowing other countries had his brains blown out on November 22nd, 1963.
Yeah, but if I were the president of the United States, I could handle this very easily. It'd be called Night of the Long Knives. And all the CIA people will wake up one morning with U.S. Marshals at their door. Their badges, their credentials would be taken away. Any weapons they had would be taken away. They'd be placed under, some sort of home arrest until we investigate their role in this. The CIA would be shut down. U.S. Marshals would flood in there and shut the whole thing down, seize the documents, remove the people, and the CIA would cease to exist overnight. That's the way you do it. You don't sit there and mumble about it, talk about it, and let these idiots who have their little covert things over there, you shut the whole thing down, Night of the Long Knives, and it's done. And it needs to happen, because I'm here to tell you right now, the CIA is running parallel government. They are running a parallel foreign policy, a parallel defense policy. We're being told one thing by the secretaries, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, who have to go before the U.S. Senate to be confirmed, and the CIA is doing something because they don't have to. They report to the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council, and there is no Senate confirmation process there. The American people need to take control of their government, take control of their foreign policy, take control of their defense policy.
How close is the United States to war, whether it's in the Middle East or in Ukraine?
We have the president saying all the right things about trying to avoid a conflict. And under normal conditions, I would say, okay, I trust him on that. But what happens if is the problem. What happens if Israel and Hezbollah explode into a straight up war and Hezbollah starts getting the upper hand and the United States decides to intervene on behalf of Israel, and then Iran intervenes on behalf of Hezbollah, and now we're at war with Iran. Now we have a major war in the Middle East that we're not going to win. What happens if Macron decides that, even though that he's going to call Putin's bluff, that he's going to put 4 Rafale fighters at Ivano-Frankivsk airfield, back them up with Mamba air defense, and then put a brigade into Odessa to sit there at Odessa. And he's not going to attack the Russians. He's going to put the brigade in as a screening force, like a tripwire, with air defense and aircraft covering it. And Putin says, why'd you do that? And he kills them all. And now France is screaming bloody murder. And the president who said that NATO is a sacred obligation now has to do something. And next thing you know, we're at war with Russia. And that's the end of the world. So we're in a situation where we may not want to go to war, but we've created policy conditions where we may be dragged into the war. And I'm really concerned about Ukraine right now because there seems to be an indifference on the part of the American people about what the consequences of war with Russia would be. I mean, you have people being dismissive of Russia's nuclear deterrence. They're just bluffing, they say. Russia doesn't bluff. They're not bluffing. And we are really at risk. If NATO wants to get involved, this thing will spiral out of control rapidly. And then the American people wake up the next morning and it's over. I mean, there's nuclear explosions going off and you're wondering, how the heck did this happen? Well, it's happening because you're not holding your government to account right now. You're not picking up the phone saying, I don't want to die in a nuclear holocaust. Let's stop this nonsense in Ukraine. Let's bring this under control. I, again, advise all Americans to call their congressman and just ask the following question. Why isn't Tony Blinken talking to Ambassador Anatoly Antonov at the Russian embassy to jumpstart arms control? Why haven't they engaged with Major General Yevgeny Babkin, the defense attaché, to talk about military on military discussions, to create confidence building measures to keep the conflict low? Why aren't we talking to these important Russians? Why are we keeping them in the dark, silent, ignoring them? Right now is the time to talk. Right now is the time to hear what they have to say, to begin a dialogue that could lead us away from this path towards war. Because by not talking to them, we become ignorant about Russia, and ignorance breeds fear. And then that fear breeds more ignorance and more harsh actions. And next thing you know, we're on an automatic path to a war that everybody claims they don't want. It's sort of like August or the summer of 1914 all over again. If you go back and look at June, July 1914, everybody in Europe said they don't want a major war. They don't want it. The diplomacy will stop. Don't worry about mobilization. Next thing you know, it's August, we're at war, and that's it, world war. That's where we are today. We're literally like in July 1914 right now, where everybody's saying we don't want a war, but they're not doing anything to stop a war.
The Pentagon needs Congress to hand over $10 billion to replace weapons sent to Ukraine. Now, this should have a huge question mark when people read this, I think, Dr. Paul, because put on the next one, here's a little bit into the article. Now, I highlighted this part. The Pentagon has sent $10 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine that it still does not have the money to replace due to congressional gridlock, according to a DoD official. Now, I just wonder about that due to a congressional gridlock, because at some point, I mean, did they just anticipate the money would be automatic? You know, you think that they might be asking the question, if we give $10 billion worth of weapons that we need to Ukraine, and we don't have the money already in the bank to pay for the new ones, maybe that's not such a good idea, you know?
But, you know, technically the money has been appropriated and is sitting there, but haven't had the final, they're down to the wire, and they're being business people, and we have to prepare. We can't give our last weapon away. We have to the Congress has to give a guarantee that they're going to give us the money to replace it. So they use it as a political weapon and pressure. They don't care about these numbers, and so the money is there because when they print the money if they don't have it, and they're not going to give up on it, which is a sad situation. And right now, though, I think the cards are in place for more Americans waking up because it's so stupid, so ridiculous, and the problems are going to be so bad, but they have to connect the problems. You know, it's when they wake up someday and say, why does bread cost me $20?
Yeah.
Oh, it has something to do with Ukraine. Oh, I don't believe that. Well, they have to become believers on what we're doing elsewhere and what we're doing in the military-industrial complex and printing all this money, and that's why their bread prices are going to go up a lot more.
You have to ask a question, what is the purpose of the U.S. military? And the answer should be to defend the United States. Well, if that is the situation, and put up the next clip if you can, if that is what it's made for, and that's what we sort of agree that we spend money for, then how is it that the military would give away the ability to defend the United States? This is from the same article. The DoD does not get the funding to backfill its stocks. The impact of that ongoing hole will ultimately be felt by the U.S. military's own forces, said the DoD official. So it would come back to our own readiness on our own stockpile to a certain extent if we can't get new funding. This is almost an admission of a crime. Yeah. They're admitting that they depleted the military. The military has been hollowed out. It can no longer protect the United States because they gave everything to a foreign country, to Ukraine.
Well, we must be getting closer to the end point. Dave DeCamp, in his article, he says, even if they gave them the weapons, they don't have any troops left. And that is a real human tragedy. Not only have a lot of people lost their lives over there, innocent people and the military people, but also thinking about all the children who have died over there, and that goes on and on. But even if they got exactly what they want in weaponry, he says they don't have the troops to use them, which is a bit of irony. But that also means that could it be that some foreign troops might be filtering in there and getting prepared? That would be a terrible, terrible escalation. We might talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, and our good friend Thomas Massey, he always is so insightful. He always cuts right to the chase. Here's a tweet he put out this morning. The so-called TikTok ban is a Trojan horse. The president will be given the power to ban websites, not just apps. The person breaking the new law is deemed to be in the U.S. or offshore internet hosting service or app store, not the foreign adversary. So it's aimed toward Americans. Now, he put a couple of clips, if you can put the next one on. Here's from his tweet. Here's a clip from the proposed law. Foreign adversary controlled application. The term foreign adversary controlled application means a website, he has that highlighted, desktop app, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So website is what we're talking about. Go to the next one, please, from the bill, the TikTok ban. This prohibition of foreign adversary controlled applications providing services to distribute, maintain, or update such application, i.e. websites, and providing internet hosting services to said website. And just go to the next one. Here's his final word on this. If you think this isn't a Trojan horse and will only apply to TikTok and foreign adversary social media companies, then contemplate why someone thought it was important to get a very specific exclusion for their internet-based businesses written into the bill. And he puts a clip from the bill that talks about what places are excluded from this. And this has to do with it allows users to post product reviews, business reviews, or travel information and reviews. They are exempt from it. So sorry to be long-winded, Dr. Paul, but he cut to the chase here. This is about giving the president the power to ban websites he doesn't like.
Yes, and that's a can of worms because, yes, we want to cancel that one particular thing because that's anti-Chinese and that fits into that scenario. But are we offering up, oh, yes, by the way, we do it too, and we're going to get away with it. We're just going to laugh at you because we're more powerful and we have more weapons currently and we have more determination. So, no, they don't do it that way. The whole thing is when you're dealing in evil, you want superior evil to the other side, and you don't give things up. And you don't try to promote the principles of liberty by setting a good example, which we as a nation did in our early years. Other people said, United States, I think they have something special going on. But that isn't the case now. It's a battle for wealth and control and money, and it's such a shame this is happening because it's not complex. It's not easy to change. We have more peace, and we'd have more prosperity. Oh, you're a traitor.
Yeah, exactly. So very bad news, I think this whole thing is. And what's to stop if the president has the power to ban a website that he deems to be a foreign adversary? Well, maybe RT will go first. No one's going to complain, oh, it's Russian. But maybe other websites who are fully American. Maybe our show. We talk too much about foreign stuff. We got to ban it. So be careful what you wish for, I think.
Right.
And a second attribute of the divine animal, rigid determinism. Now, the Stoics agreed with Epicurus that universal cause and effect means rigid determinism. They simply took the other side of the conclusion. They said there is rigid cause and effect, and therefore everything is determined. There is no such thing as free will anywhere in the universe, neither in man nor in God. Everything that happens is an inevitable expression of God's nature. He cannot arbitrarily will or choose anything. He's not a Christian God or a Jewish God. He's a Stoic God. Everything, therefore, is fixed from all eternity. Indeed, for the Stoics, the universe goes through rigidly fixed cycles. They were influenced in part here by their reading of Heraclitus, and they held that at one time the universe was a huge fire, sometimes called the Great Bonfire with a capital G and B. And then, following immutable laws, it goes through various stages of development, worlds are formed and so on. And then, since after all, the universe is finite, in their view there's only so many elements, at a certain point the original combination must be reached again. The original state must be reached again. In other words, we have another fire, a great bonfire. And then we go around the cycle the next time. Since the same ingredients exist following the same laws, we must go through the identical development. It's like a deck of cards shuffled according to an inexorable law. You keep going through cycles, each step repeated in the same order identically each time. So, for instance, on this view, you have, whether you remember it or not, and obviously the Stoics didn't think you would, you have had this lecture on the Stoics an infinite number of times already. You came to the Hilton every Thursday an infinite number of times, and you will do it an infinite number of times in the future. I will give the identical lecture. You will ask the identical questions. I sometimes wonder why it is that we have to go through it so many times, but You see, the idea is everything comes back eternally. This is known as the doctrine of eternal return. And it simply is a dramatic way of emphasizing the rigid, inexorable rule of destiny. I should say that this doctrine of eternal return or eternal recurrence was picked up by Nietzsche, among other philosophers, and subscribed to by several philosophers much later. Now, you might wonder at this point, well, how can you have an ethics at all if you hold such a doctrine? How can you say what people should do or shouldn't do if everything is inevitable and they do what they have to do? Well, that is a problem. It is called the problem of freedom. And the problem is, if there isn't any, how can you have ethics? How can you prescribe how men should behave? How can you hold them responsible? How can you praise them or blame them? Now, this is a problem that the Stoics struggled with desperately, but unsuccessfully. We will note the same problem under Christianity, which had it in spades, and also struggled desperately with. In general, this is a problem for any deterministic metaphysics, and is in fact insoluble on such a metaphysics, though determinists from the time of the Stoics to the present have made endless attempts to solve this problem and to reconcile determinism with morality. If you're interested in the typical modern attempt to do so, I'll be glad to explain that in the question period. Well then, to summarize the metaphysics of the Stoics, it's got three central concepts which you can put in any order you want. A teleological deterministic pantheism, a pantheistic deterministic teleology, a teleological pantheism, you get it. As to the Stoic epistemology, I will mention simply in a sentence or so 2 points of some importance for later philosophy. First, the later Roman Stoics in particular emphasized that man was born with certain innate ideas as a God-given cognitive endowment to enable us in effect to start the process of acquiring knowledge. After all, your mind is a part of God since God is everything, and as such it contains at birth, they thought, at least some of God's ideas. Although many of the Stoics also, being eclectic on this type of issue, emphasized the role of the senses in a more Aristotelian manner. But insofar as they advocated innate ideas, the Stoics continued and transmitted the Platonist, rationalist epistemology, and they were thus one of the main links on this issue between Plato and the rationalists of the modern era. And the second point I'll mention briefly of their epistemology. In answer to the question, when can you claim absolute certainty? The Stoics came up with the so-called doctrine of irresistibility, which amounts, stripped of its fancy language, to the following. In the process of seeking an answer to some question, you should raise, consider, answer all possible doubts, until at a certain point you will suddenly see in an incontestable insight, in an irresistible insight, that the idea in question is unanswerable, is true. And such an irresistible insight they described as one which was, quote, clear and distinct, unquote. Now I simply ask you to remember the terms clear and distinct. You'll see what happens to this issue when we get to Descartes, who in many ways is influenced by the Stoics. I think you can see that this is a pretty feeble epistemology. And many later Stoics gave up under the onslaught of the skeptics and said, well, I guess we never can be certain of any truth, only achieve probability.
So the White House announced on Tuesday that the U.S. is sending a new $300 million arms package to Ukraine. That includes more cluster bombs, which are notorious for killing and maiming civilians. So you might be wondering, where did they get the money from for this? I just covered a story yesterday that the Pentagon is saying they need $10 billion to replenish weapons that they've already sent to Ukraine. Congress has not authorized new spending on this proxy war, yet they came up with this money. And U.S. officials are claiming that this is being paid for with savings in the U.S. Army budget. They saved on some contracts, and they're saying that's what's paying for this. And this is the first U.S. arms package to be announced since December 27th, so the first one of this year. So White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan announced the package and said it was, quote, assistance that Ukraine desperately needs to hold the line against Russian attacks and to push back against the continuing Russian onslaught in the East and other parts of Ukraine, end quote. Sorry, he said in the East twice, I guess. So Sullivan also pleaded for Congress to approve the $60 billion President Biden is seeking to fuel the proxy war for another year. Sullivan said, quote, we have said repeatedly here in the briefing room, and President Biden said it to the entire nation, that we cannot provide ongoing assistance to Ukraine without significantly impacting our military readiness, absent congressional action, end quote. So it's interesting he's saying that they can't provide assistance to Ukraine without impacting U.S. military readiness as he's announcing this new weapons package. So I thought it was important, the reason why I made the headlines about the cluster bombs was because they're actually sending two different types of cluster bombs now. And it's kind of become normalized, I guess, that the U.S. has been arming Ukraine with cluster bombs. I still think it's a very, very big deal. So the package includes, and this is what the Pentagon publicly announced, it includes a cluster bomb variant of the 155 millimeter artillery shells known as the dual purpose improved conventional munitions. And the U.S. first began shipping these artillery shells to Ukraine last year. It was a big controversy when it first happened. And again, now the shipments were regular until the U.S. stopped sending the weapons packages at the end of December. And Politico also reported that the new arms package includes a cluster bomb variant of the Army tactical missile systems, and these are known as anti-personnel, anti-material missiles. So the ATACMS, these are missiles that Ukraine has been seeking for a while. They've been asking for the newer, more advanced version that can hit targets up to 190 miles away. This version is an older cluster bomb version that has a range of about 100 miles, and the U.S. started sending these to Ukraine last year as well, secretly. They didn't announce it at first when they first sent them, but eventually admitted it. So this was not publicly announced by the Pentagon, but Politico cited U.S. officials who said they were also sending these cluster bombs. So these are long-range cluster bombs with a 100-mile range that they're sending to Ukraine. I mean, it's absolutely insane. And 4 U.S. Army vessels carrying about 100 troops departed Virginia on Tuesday with equipment to build a temporary port on Gaza's coast. So the idea of this port, according to Biden and other U.S. officials, is to get more aid into Gaza, where the entire population is facing food shortages and children are starving to death. President Biden is taking the extreme measure instead of pressuring Israel to allow more aid into the Strip by cutting military assistance. So according to a report from the Jerusalem Post, this idea to build a port was actually Netanyahu's idea. That's where this initially came from. This report said that Netanyahu proposed the idea to Cyprus's president in October, and under the U.S. plan, the aid will go through Cyprus, and it will also be subject to Israeli inspection, which means it could be turned away. And the port is not expected to be completed for 60 days, and that's 2 months. That's a long time, and many Palestinians could starve to death in that time. A total of 1,000 U.S. troops will be deployed to build the pier, which puts them at risk of being targeted by Hamas. Haiti's Prime Minister Ariel Henry has agreed to resign after the U.S. had a little chat with him. That's the way these things seem to go. So Haitian Prime Minister Ariel Henry has announced that he will step down and make way for a transitional government nearly 2 years after assuming power in the wake of the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. The move comes as the Caribbean nation is gripped by violent unrest, with armed groups seizing areas of the capital city and clashing with local security forces. So Henry announced this in Puerto Rico, where he has been stranded for days due to the chaos in Port-au-Prince. And things really escalated when he was over in Kenya trying to get this intervention force to support his government, which was not elected. He assumed power. The U.S. backed him. But since he's lost his grip, the U.S. said, all right, enough of you. We want to, I think they have some other people in mind for the next government. But, this intervention force that the U.S. is backing, and they pledged another $100 million for it, so that's $200 million that the U.S. is pledging for this intervention in Haiti. I think the plan was just a few thousand Kenyan police. I don't know how that's really going to get things under control. And of course, we're seeing a lot of kind of, propaganda about Haiti, which seems to be aimed at convincing people that they need intervention again. But even with all the violence in Haiti, when you see media outlets that actually talk to people in Haiti, that most people say, the general consensus is no Western intervention. There's a very dark history of U.S. intervention, involvements in coups and everything, and they don't want that.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
This is from today's Wall Street Journal. U.S. boosts global role as arms exporter. Isn't that nice? How arms exporter? Who the fuck are you talking to? Who are you talking to? Things to kill people with. Bombs, missiles, guns, arms. They shove my arm up your ass. Oh, by the way, I'm hated for speaking about peace. Matter of fact, I'm threatened to be killed for speaking about peace. Oh, I only launched Occupy Peace over a decade ago. I was doing InfoWars on Monday, and I read, "Peace times are over. EU states PM. Europe's peaceful era has ended," Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has said. "The times for peace are over. The post-war era is over. We are living in new times, the pre-war era." And I said, who the hell is this guy to say this shit? Who the hell is he to say it? They keep ramping it up. This guy Stoltenberg, who's the NATO general, Secretary General, he said last month that the U.S.-led alliance should brace for, quote, a confrontation that could last for decades. These fuckfaces are taking us to war. And the same, I can't call him a prick, this Stoltenberg, a little arrogant fuck of nothing, he rejects the Pope's white flag for Ukraine to appeal for peace. Quote, it's not the time to talk about surrender to Ukrainians by the Ukrainians. That will be a tragedy for the Ukrainians. It will also be dangerous for all of us. Who the fuck are you talking about, all of us? This has been going on between Russia and Ukraine for what, how many hundreds of years? Who are you bullshitting? So going back to the markets. Yeah, the markets went up today, gold went down. The bet's still on the street that they're going to be lowering interest rates. And we're saying they're going to, definitely going to. They're going to lower them in Canada. They're going to lower them in Europe. They're going to lower them in the U.S. in the months to come. They're going to boost up the economy. The economy is going down. The inflation data came in. We're in dragflation. When you look at the real inflation data, it's double from what they're saying. And you go to John Williams' shadow stats and you can see the facts. Oh, the housing prices in America, they're around $400,000. No, we're not going to include that. Oh, steak prices. No, the people are eating differently. We're changing it. So you're looking at, we're in dragflation. You have a recession in the UK. You have a recession in Germany. The third largest economy in the world, the largest in Europe. This is dragflation, not stagflation. It's not stagnant. The economy is going to go down and inflation keeps going up. They say the numbers come. Yeah, the prices of houses haven't gone down. They've gone up. The house prices of cars haven't gone down. They've gone up. The prices of insurance haven't gone down. They've gone up. So this is serious. And no one's talking about the banks go bust crisis. They're mentioning it in little pieces and here and there. So this is very serious. So in your Trends Journal this week, we have, of course, the economic update, layoffs on the rise. This is our 75th week. 75th week of putting all the layoffs going on. Oh, and you know what the news came out today? IBM is going to be firing more people in the coming months. And you know why? AI, we own you. And these numbers that are inflated stock prices. Because when you look at all the people, it's like 204 high-tech firms fired people since the beginning of this year. So when you're looking at the numbers, they're inflated. They're not real. Because they're firing people, so the stock prices are going up because they're making more money because they got less people. So it's very important to watch. We are on a crisis edge over here. The U.S. trade deficit went up. Yeah, more than expected. No kidding. And then trends on the global economic front. When the economy fails, jobs go with it. All our going out of business trends. And by the way, the richest countries in the world are hitting high debt levels. It's at now, you ready? $56 trillion.
Here's a little secret that supporters of the monster state never want you to learn about. Partnerships don't work when half the team quits. And that's really getting into a big picture overview of the strategy that we use from the founding generation. Stop participating and stop complying. And the first report I want to cover today comes from Kansas, where a House committee held a hearing on a bill that would prohibit state and local enforcement of most federal gun control on the books, past, present, and whatever they decide to throw at us in the future. Titled, and this is from Mike Meharry's report from a couple of days ago, titled the Kansas Gun Rights Preservation Act. The bill would prohibit an agency of the state, a political subdivision of the state, and their employees from knowingly and willingly participating in any way in the enforcement of any federal act, law, executive order, administrative order, rule, or regulation regarding a firearm, firearm accessory, or ammunition against a law-abiding citizen. I hate the term law-abiding citizen because, well, there's too many laws on the books, and it's pretty easy to point out that most citizens are not law-abiding because of all these superfluous, unconstitutional laws. But what they did do in this legislation, House Bill 2803, was they defined law-abiding citizen as an individual who was not otherwise precluded under state law from possessing a firearm. So no federal rules would apply whatsoever. Well, they're not saying that they won't apply. They're just saying we're not going to help you. On a signature or veto from the governor of Wyoming on Senate file or Senate Bill 109. This is the Prohibit Red Flag Gun Seizure Act. This is taking the same process that they're looking at in at least considering that they had a committee hearing on it, which is an important first first step in the process. And there were a lot of people who testified in support. Of course, all the opposition really came from law enforcement groups. Mike Meharry covers that in his report. All the law enforcement lobby groups, they always are against anything that restricts their ability to work with the federal government because the feds throw them so much cash to help them out with federal gun control, the drug war, civil asset forfeiture, all kinds of surveillance, etc., because they feed all this information to the feds. They do all this work. So the Prohibit Red Flag Gun Seizure Act takes the same approach as that Kansas legislation, just on something very narrow. When Wyoming has tried to go broad on this, and you would think Wyoming would be really good on this, well, their legislature is absolute garbage. They are 100% thin blue line. So when the cops say, well, this is going to harm our relationship with our federal partners, what they do is they water down the legislation so they can continue working with their federal partners, which they shouldn't be doing if they're following their oath of office. And this was on, it looks like Monday. The Idaho Senate passed a bill, according to Mike Meharry, that would create a process for the state to hold a portion of its reserves in physical gold and silver. This is Senate Bill 1314, which passed on March 11th by a vote of 25-9 out of the state Senate. The bill's statement of purpose notes that holding a portion of state funds in physical gold and silver would, quote, help secure state assets against the risks of inflation and financial turmoil and or to achieve capital gains as measured in Federal Reserve notes. So they're actually in legislation that moved out of the Idaho Senate just this week. They're specifically saying that the Federal Reserve is, well, inflating. They're increasing the money supply and therefore reducing the value of the dollar. And this is a way to hedge against that. Now, this can also help achieve a little bit of financial independence in the case of bigger problems that might be on our way. Now, Tennessee was the first state to pass legislation like this last year. This is an expansion, or I think an improvement in Idaho. And then in Utah, House Bill 348, which I've covered a couple of times on the show, is actually sitting on the governor's desk. It would allow the state treasurer to invest up to 10% of certain state funds into silver, gold, platinum, copper, or palladium. And Mike Meharry describes it like this. Holding gold and silver will allow the state, whether it's Utah or Idaho or Tennessee, to shield its assets and hedge against rapidly depreciating Federal Reserve notes, fiat trash. Holding, well, he didn't put that in a report. He's a professional. Holding gold and silver in reserve would also create a pathway for Utah or whatever other state to maintain financial independence should the U.S. dollar collapse, a very real possibility as the world moves away from the greenback as its reserve currency. I know a lot of supporters of the show are also fans of BTC, for example, and they always ask us, well, why not do that? Well, I think if you support that, you definitely want to contact your state legislator and say, hey, here's another option for us to move away from the Federal Reserve notes and maybe put a portion of state funds into this. The more that states can do this, the more we'll see them be resilient against the financial turmoil caused by the central bank. So not only do the feds ban the transportation of raw milk across state lines, but they also claim the authority to ban raw milk within the borders of the state. There is nothing whatsoever that authorizes the federal government to ban the sale, production, or ownership of any product within state borders. That is only up to the people of each state. And here, from the FDA, it is well within our authority to institute an intrastate ban on unpasteurized milk as well. That's what they wrote in response to a Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund lawsuit against the interstate ban. I'm not sure whatever went down with that lawsuit. But anyways, by a vote of 95-1, the West Virginia House on Monday gave final approval to this bill, House Bill 4911, to legalize raw milk sales in the state with no restrictions or limits. They currently have very limited raw milk sales allowed in West Virginia in what's called kind of herd sharing agreements. Basically, you have to own part of a cow and you have to go there and pick it up, and it makes it very inconvenient. Surprisingly enough, if I want to purchase raw milk or raw cheese or whatever here in Southern California, I can find that all over the place. It's easy. I can find it in major grocery stores, not in a Whole Foods Amazon store, but a lot of other major stores and chains actually carry it. But in a place like West Virginia or Wisconsin, the dairy lobby is very, very powerful and they don't like competition. But anyway, so they currently have very limited sales allowed, but this would expand it to full retail raw milk sales in the state with no restrictions or limits at all. No amounts, no where you can purchase. Anyone who wants to buy or sell can. All they have to do, the only restriction they have is to label it very clearly as what it is.
And Tom, why don't you tell us a little bit about your new book that is out now, and you'd like to talk about it. Tell us.
Well, I thought it was an opportune moment because we are approaching now the 4-year anniversary of 15 Days to Slow the Spread. So that seemed as good a time as any to talk about it. And, just the other day I was saying there have been 3 incidents in the 21st century in which we've heard people say, I wouldn't want to be a libertarian right about now. Yeah. And the first one was 9/11. The second one was the economic downturn in 2008. And the third one was COVID. You wouldn't want to be a libertarian during a pandemic. And yet, in retrospect, I would want to be a libertarian during all of these. The libertarian response to all of these was optimal, was far better than the actual response that we got. And so the purpose of my Diary of a Psychosis is, is to reach those people who are reachable. There are some people, if they're wearing a mask in an airport today, who are just not reachable.
Yeah.
But there are some, and we still have literally billions of people around the world who think that the public health establishment in the various countries did their best under trying circumstances, and they saved a lot of lives, and yeah, it was inconvenient, but they did the best they could. There are a lot of people who still think that. And Diary of a Psychosis is a merciless, ceaseless attack with a sledgehammer on this argument. Because the point of it is, none of it did any good. And I know that a lot of our people, and I love our people, I've been around them my whole life, want to start this story on chapter 37 and start by telling everybody about all the sinister forces running the world. And I totally understand and am sympathetic to that. But most people right now need to start at chapter 1. And chapter 1 is, none of the stuff they did to us did any good, and it did a huge amount of harm.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Here's what the cover of the book looks like. I cringe when I hear the word COVID now, but what your book does, it's very different. And now, if you don't mind, just explain why it is so different.
Well, there are other books on COVID, and I like some of them. But mine is not like I have a chapter on lockdowns and a chapter on masks. Mine really is like a diary where we're walking through as these things are happening. And because I was recording this stuff as it was happening, I remember all those little details that a lot of people may have forgotten. Like, I remember Alachua County, not too far from where I live in Florida. They established some rule of you could have one person in your retail establishment per 1,000 square feet. And the board or whoever was in charge was asked, well, how did you come up with that figure? I mean, what scientific principles were behind that? And they said, well, we thought 1 per 1,000 was easy math for everybody to do. So that's just a little detail, but I remember all those. And you put all those together, it reproduces what it was like. And I feel like we need this for a couple of reasons. First of all, we need our kids to understand what we endured, because it's hard to explain it to them. They have to actually be able to experience it. But the other thing is, I have people telling me, you should just forget this and move on. But I feel like, when has that ever worked? Oh, just forget this outrage by the government and just move on. Could you imagine Thomas Jefferson saying, the government completely ruined your life, but just forget it. These things happen.
They had no idea what was going on, but they had a very good idea of what you should do, which is
yes,
listen to them.
Right.
That's it. Well, at the time you were doing this, Dr. Paul and I were following your work very closely, because I almost felt like we developed a sense of community among the people that got it. And I have to admit, the people who I respected who didn't get it, who went on the other side, and I won't name them, but I've lost respect for them that I'll never gain back again, no matter what they've done. Subsequently, even things that I agree with them on. If you get this wrong, I just don't want to have anything to do with you. I hate to say it, I just feel honestly, but we felt when you were doing this separately, we actually did a conference once with Mises where we were all talking about it, I think in 2020. But just having you put these together, because you have such a great rhetorical flair, I mean, you have a great way of presenting facts in a way, but just having you as an ally when we did the show every day was so helpful.
But and pointing out, as Tom has, about all the dumb things and all the rules and regulations and it all being wrong. But we haven't said a whole lot about the real evil. And that is, this is authoritarian, this is a mandate, and if you don't listen, by golly, you're going to be punished. And they punished a lot of people, and there's been a lot of people who suffered medical diseases. But do you think somebody's going to have liability for the people who have died from this? So that also is the big issue, and the families who have suffered from this, realize this. But people have, the more you followed your conscience and good economic policies and good medical policies, more likely is that you would have suffered more than anybody wants to look at.
Well, I will say, and I'm saying this not just because his dad is on the screen with me, but I will say that Senator Rand Paul did a fantastic job through all this, as did the gentleman we were talking about earlier, Thomas Massie. And both of them came out of the Ron Paul revolution. I mean, one of them came right out of the Ron Paul household. But what impressed me about this is that I feel like if we had had a President Romney would have told us that we need to follow what Fauci says, and he would have continued that for 4 years, and the Republican Party, would have gone along. If this had been 2012, let's say. But something had changed by 2024, that there were enough right-of-center people who were willing to say, call me all the names you want, but I do not accept these so-called experts you've trotted out. I think for a long time, Republicans and people on the right, they're so desperate to look respectable that they wouldn't have dared stand up to an Anthony Fauci. And to see how many commentators did and openly ridiculed the public health establishment is extremely refreshing.
Yeah, I would say Senator Paul will go down in history, because he is the guy who dethroned Fauci. I mean, he slashed him up like a slasher movie, and it was beautiful to see.
All right, now let's turn to the Stoic ethics. And first, their view of man. What is man on this philosophy? Well, if everything is God, if God is all that exists, then a man is only a part or a piece of God. In Epictetus' phrase, man is a, quote, fragment torn from God. His soul is a part of the world soul. His body is a part of the world body. He is not, and this is the crucial point, any longer to be viewed as an autonomous creature, as a separate individual, as an individual metaphysically on his own, owning himself, without allegiance to anything but himself. That latter was the view that Aristotle had held, that Epicurus had held. It was not, of course, the view that Plato had held, and in this respect also the Stoics reflect a definite Platonic legacy. Man is, in their terms, to be viewed strictly as a part of a larger whole, as a part of God, temporarily severed from God, but still only a part of God, owing allegiance to God, in other words, to the whole of which he's only a part. And we know that the universe or God has a plan, a purpose, that man is on earth in accordance with God's plan, that he has a role assigned to him in that plan. We know, therefore, that man has obligations imposed on him by the fact of not being a metaphysically autonomous entity, the fact of being only a part of a wider whole. In a word, man has duties, which he must obey. Not for reward, for gain, for pleasure, for any personal advantage, but strictly because they are his duties. Thus, for the first time, we get an avowed morality of duty, in stark contrast to the approach of Aristotle, or Epicurus, or even Plato much of the time. Of course, it's implicit in Plato, but to a good extent, Plato held that virtues are to be practiced because they lead to happiness, fulfillment, because some advantage accrues to you. The Stoics, however, on the basis of their metaphysics of pantheism, and their view that it's hopeless to try to achieve any values in life, abandon the traditional Greek approach to morality and instead make morality an issue of doing what's right because it's right. Doing your duty because it's your duty, period, regardless of any advantages or disadvantages, regardless of its effects on you. A duty morality is essentially any morality which separates virtues from values, or actions from rewards. And it is, of course, the antithesis of the objectivist approach to morality. If you will notice, in Galt's speech, virtue is defined as the action by means of which one attains value. And that very definition, of course, effaces the possibility of a duty approach to ethics. In this respect, the Stoics are one of the main sources of what Kant later took over and blew up into astronomical proportions. Now, I'll give you a brief quote from Marcus Aurelius on this point. Quote, "When thou hast done well to another, and another has fared well at thy hands, why go on like the foolish to look for a third thing besides, that is, the credit of having done well, or some return for it? Is not it enough that thou hast done something in accordance with thy nature? Seekest thou a recompense for it? As though the eye should claim a reward for seeing, or the feet for walking. For just as these latter were made for their special work, and by carrying this out, they come fully into their own, so also man, formed as he is by nature for benefiting others, when he has acted as benefactor for the general welfare, has done what he was constituted for, and has what is his." You see, you don't ask any more, therefore, unquote. What is in it for me to be moral? That is a wrong approach. To be moral is to do your duty. Just as the eye doesn't say, what is in it for me to see? To be an eye is to see, like it or lump it. Now I think you can grasp how the road is being paved for Christianity, where ethics becomes a matter of following commandments because God commanded them, period. Of course, the Stoics are not Christians. They're pagans. They believe that you can establish your duties rationally, not by revelation, but the basic duty theme nevertheless appears in them. And it is, you see, their answer to the question, on what basis should you act once you've abandoned personal values? And the answer is, on duty. Now, I should mention that as Greeks, the Stoics were not consistent in their duty approach to morality. It was common for them, part of the time, to advocate duty as an end in itself, regardless of any advantages that it brought, and part of the time to declare that the justification of doing your duty is the advantages it brings to you personally. For instance, inner tranquility, peace of mind, a sense of moral virtue, happiness. In this respect, there's not too much difference between the Stoics and Plato, insofar as their approach to morality is distinctive. Both advocate placing something above your own happiness, such as sacrifice, duty, etc. But insofar as they're both Greek, neither ever lost the appreciation in some form of individual happiness as the ultimate goal of morality. So neither Platonism nor Stoicism is consistent on this point, and you should know this for historical accuracy. I may say the same is true of Christianity, which preaches that you should follow God's commandments because he commanded them regardless of any advantage to you, which is a purely duty approach, and yet promises otherworldly happiness for eternity if you do so, which is a legacy of the Greek idea that a reward is the justification of virtue, which was carried over by Christianity into a supernatural form. A completely consistent duty approach to morality, which expunges every element of advantage from ethics and makes it completely a matter of selfless obedience to duty, with no value placed on happiness as a moral justification, had to wait for the time of Immanuel Kant. That was his contribution to ethics. In this respect, Kant's ethics is the sacrifice pro-duty element of Plato, the Stoics, and Christianity, stripped of every mitigating Greek feature. The Stoics, however, are not nearly as consistent or as corrupt as Kant. No Greek, however bad he became, ever dreamed of approaching the man-destroying evil later adopted and proclaimed by Kant and his followers.
On National Public Radio shortly after January the 6th, they interviewed Robert Grenier, he's the author of 88 Days to Kandahar. He had been the CIA station chief in Islamabad at the dawn of the terror war, and kind of inadvertently showed how they helped let bin Laden escape. But anyway, Grenier was interviewed on NPR, and it's this great little double entendre of cool stuff going on, because what he does is he explains, outright admits, that's right, we let Osama bin Laden go. We decided, forget Al-Qaeda, we don't want to get the guys what hit us and killed our people. We want to go after the sort of milieu of extremism in which they were thriving, which meant regime change in Kabul, while bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, moonwalk across the border unhindered and unchased by Delta Force, who wanted only to kill them. Grenier explains this is the analogy now. He outright admits their treason in helping bin Laden get away. But then he says, that's smart, and that's what we're going to do now. See, the January 6th rioters, the insurrectionists, they're Al-Qaeda in this scenario. And what we want to do is not so much focus on them, as we want to focus on, that sort of broader milieu of extremism in which they're thriving, by which he meant the American right, the entire American right, the pro-Donald Trump MAGA movement, or the Taliban. And we're going to regime change their ass because of what Al-Qaeda did at the Capitol that day, he said.
Yeah, I'm looking at this right now, actually. A New York Times opinion, how to defeat America's homegrown insurgency. Let me just add to this, actually, just because, I'm one of these sort of weird guys who spent way too much time in DARPA grant, looking through all the DARPA grants for this type of stuff, with how they actually make the sausage for censorship. I am willing to bet a bagel that Robert Grenier did not come up with this sort of hypothesis about how to manage the homegrown insurgency by doing it targeting the middle rather than leaders or whatnot on his own. That is what you just said is strikingly similar to the DARPA-funded domestic censorship grants that were given out to 60-some universities between 2016 and 2020. There's one that immediately comes to mind called "Slaying the Online Hate Hydra," which basically posited that if you were against open borders, you were effectively engaging in sort of identitarian hate speech. And they were using the same sort of proxy in Europe for groups that all happened to be peace with Russia parties or anti-war parties, because they tended to be working class and wanted cheap energy from improved Russian economic ties. And so, of course, the CIA the State Department were plotting to kill all those or politically subjugate all those political parties, and they often would use these hate speech predicates to do it. And what was really fascinating about, for example, just this one thing, just as a reference for the audience if they want to look this up, "Slaying the Online Hate Hydra." This is a DARPA-funded censorship research grant, which examined 4 different ways to go about ideally censoring the internet in order to take out basically people who had the wrong thinking opinions when it comes to things like immigration. And the first way, was like the classic top-down type thing. Like, you kicked down. This is back in 2018, I think, is when this grant was. This is like 3 years before Trump was actually kicked off Twitter. They said, we could kick these people, we could kick the leaders off of the social media companies. But the problem is there's often this kind of martyr effect, and it sort of feeds into the same issue we have with insurgency, where we kill one high-profile person, but that act of martyrdom creates 100 new insurgents because they're all mad that their leader has been taken down. So they said, okay, well, what if we don't do top-down censorship, and what if we topographically map the network of connections that the leaders have to their, say, lieutenant class? Who are the top 20 lieutenants who are not as high profile, who are not household names, who tend to be the key amplifiers of the leader, so that when the leader, sort of tweets something out or makes a YouTube video or a Facebook post, it doesn't have that same level of virality because they had their top sort of, second in command type, the sort of lieutenant class amplifiers are gone. That's one way we could do it that would minimize the martyr effect. Another way is we could keep the leaders, and we could keep a lot of the lieutenants, but we could do a sort of, we could topographically map the whole network, and we could just sort of slowly or randomly or partially ban or throttle or suppress the sort of great unwashed middle, who so that way everybody still nobody notices that censorship is happening, because the highest profile people still have their accounts, and so do the sort of semi-celebrity people who amplify them. But they're just not, it just looks like they're organically not having any traction, not having any amplification, because the people who don't have a voice to defend themselves are the ones who are getting kicked off the internet.
These people are evil, man. How do they? These are Americans?
Yes.
Well, okay, so let's talk about.
And you should, by the way, Scott, you should see, I have all this, by the way, on my Twitter page. I've gone over this. Yeah. Like Ben Cyber, and just, I think if you type in either DARPA or "Slaying the Online Hate Hydra," you'll see this. The mathematical equations that they actually sketch out to do this are a true sight to behold. I mean, it's almost like, it looks, now I'm not, a sort of math quant guy, but the the level of computer science engineering that they propose to go into creating this vast system to do exactly what you were just saying Robert Grenier was proposing, but for internet censorship in 2018, mind you. I mean, it was a level of technical technical precision that is that is truly shocking, and shows that the depths that they'll go to actually execute this.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
You go on to say, this is a hot esoteric subject. Aquinas taught that all rational persons are capable of discerning right from wrong and good from evil by the exercise of free will and human reason, and they do not need the government to aid them in this endeavor. This is generally known as natural law. Judge, what the hell are you talking about, natural law? I'm the government. I'll tell you what to do. Listen to me. I don't care if your mother, your father, your sister, or brother are dying. We got COVID going on, and you can't go see them as they're breathing their last breath. I'm the governor of New Jersey. I'm the governor of Massachusetts. I'm the governor of New York and California. You have no natural law. This is America.
Well, you described this perfectly in characterizing recent events through which we all sadly lived. They trampled natural law and natural rights. I mean, the theory of natural law is it's a restraint on the government. The government is bound by natural law. Of course, it's not. I mean, they all take the oath to uphold the Constitution. Natural law is expressly embodied in the Ninth Amendment. They don't care about it. But if they recognized natural law, we would truly be a free country. Because
there's this guy who's playing the Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk. He came out last week and said, quote, you ready? The time for peace is over.
Oh, boy.
The post-war era is over. We are living through new times. You ready? The pre-war times.
Wow. They are just crazy. They're going to poke the bear, and the bear has nuclear weapons. And Biden has, here I'm confusing them. Putin has no interest whatsoever in Kyiv or in Warsaw. He just wants to make sure that the ethnic Russians in Ukraine are not killed by their own government, and that Ukraine does not join NATO and put offensive weaponry at his border. That's it. That was the deal that was crafted 2 years ago in Turkey. The agreement, I'm holding my fingers up an inch apart. The agreement was an inch thick. The agreement was initialed by the Russian negotiators and the Ukrainian negotiators. They were ready to sign it until Joe Biden sent that goofball Boris Johnson, then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, to say to Zelensky, don't sign it, don't sign it. We'll back you. The Americans will back you. We'll get rid of Putin. We'll steal back your Crimea. You'll be a great country again, all because of this war. We'll help you fight and win. 2 years later, 500,000 young men dead or so disabled they can't go back to the military, Ukrainian young men. And Putin within inches of capturing the territory that's ethnic Russian. How do we know what's ethnic Russian? Because the Zelensky government has been bombing them. It would be like Washington bombing a portion of New Mexico where Mexicans lived. That's the moral equivalent of what Zelensky is doing and has been doing, and that the Russians are trying to stop.
Again, what you're saying, these are all facts, and people have no idea. They killed in the Donbass region before this began over 15,000 people. And the Donbass, what happened was when they had the coup, they put in that guy Yatsenyuk. And matter of fact, Victoria Nuland was caught on the phone with that guy, another little boy of nothing, Jeffrey Pyatt, who is the UN ambassador to Ukraine, saying F you to the EU. She actually said the word, Right. And we're going to put Yatsenyuk, a little nothing of a clown. And then they put in that other guy, Poroshenko. And then and again, this isn't my data. These are the facts. 89% of the Ukrainian people, according to the latest poll, their number one concern, over 90%, of course, is the war. 89%, government corruption.
Wow. Well, the 300 million that the Defense Department just found, I wonder how much of it is cash. So they might as well put it in the fireplace and light it on fire.
So going back to what he said, we're saying World War III has begun, this little clown boy at Tusk over there in Poland, the fight against totalitarian trends corruption, and lies is taking place on many fronts. The most dramatic illustration of this, of course, what is happening in the war in Ukraine. We are facing a simple choice. Either we fight to protect our borders, territory, and values, and defend our citizens and future generations, or accept the alternative that is defeat. Then that other arrogant little boy, that NATO Secretary Stoltenberg, last month he said, the U.S.-led alliance should brace for, quote, a confrontation that could last for decades.
Wow. Well, you were right. When all else fails, they take you to war. World War III has begun.
It's begun. And the people have no clue. They have no clue of what's going on. And when you tell them about this, the first reaction is people say, oh, those Russians, they're trying to grip. Stop. They have no clue of anything. So I'm very concerned. I'm very concerned with what's going on, and the people must unite for peace, or else we're going to die in war.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
This is Thomas Massey. I haven't watched his full speech yet, but he put this out on Twitter, and I thought that it was a good point. Let's give it a listen.
An overly broad bill, and they got an exclusion written into the bill that I want to read. It says the term covered company does not include an entity that operates a website or application whose primary purpose is to allow users to post product reviews, business reviews, or travel information and reviews. Why is this exception in the bill? Why did somebody feel like they needed this exception if the bill itself only covers social media applications that foreign adversaries are running? These and other questions we hope to answer in the course of this debate, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves the...
I think it's obvious to all of us that they're trying to find new ways that they can regulate the internet, that they can make sure that there isn't competition in ideas, that the information that you're seeing is being controlled by the United States government, that the algorithms are being controlled by the United States government. And so this is probably just the starting point for, things that might even end up pushing, the Twitters, Elon Musk, or otherwise. All right. And
the vote this morning was a vote to protect the national security of our country and the privacy of our citizens. I pointed out at the time that the TikTok in China broadcast into Taiwan that the Uyghurs love what the Chinese are doing. It's genocide. The people in Hong Kong love the crushing of their democracy in Hong Kong. And the Tibetans talked about how they are suppressed on TikTok there and how they are misrepresented on TikTok there. So for these and other reasons, this is about human rights and privacy and democracy. But most importantly, if the Chinese government, as it does with ByteDance and its partnership, controls the algorithm, we are at their mercy.
I want to pause here because this is what I was talking about of when they talk about the fear of what China is able to do. Aren't they kind of showing their hands when they talk about, oh, but they'll have all this big data? Yeah, but you have all the big data. Oh, well, if they can control the algorithms, you mean what you guys are doing? Because I don't believe for one second that YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and the likes are without influence of government. I mean, you still got those lawsuits going on about what was going on during COVID. I've been listening to a little bit of the Supreme Court hearings about it, but we all know that they were like, hey, we'd really appreciate if some of that information wasn't available. Hey, we're looking at the information available, and it looks like your algorithm is still pushing this kind of content. Hey, it appears to us, magically, the advertisers all care about these specific safety standards and ensuring that this kind of information isn't available. Hey, Boeing, before you go and you spend more money on the YouTube platform, do you mind having a conversation with them to make sure that people that are criticizing the Israel war aren't being amplified? I don't know if that's a particular censorship, but they're kind of showing you the hands here that the algorithms of the way the content is being pushed on the platform is very important to governments. And so we can't have a China apparatus within our country because then we can't control the algorithm to make sure that our kids aren't dancing too much, which that one I approve. You guys want to come forward and say, hey, there's a little bit too much dancing going on the internet. I'll get behind that one. All right, this one's interesting. Boeing whistleblower who raised safety concerns found dead. Attorney says he's shocked. And for those of you guys who are not in the know on the story, the Boeing whistleblower did have some juicy claims. And hopefully there's enough other people who are covering this that the Boeing people don't get insights onto my channel. But here we have the guy. He's on TMZ talking about the problems at the Boeing plants and how they're not properly doing safety checks. They don't have proper concerns. They're shoving planes into the air that shouldn't be in the air. Let's give this a watch.
The FAA is saying that the plane is now safe to fly. What do you say? one, this is not a 737 problem. It's a Boeing problem. And I know the FAA's gone in and they've done due diligence and inspections to assure that the door plugs of the 737 are installed properly and the fasteners are torqued properly. But my concern is, what's the rest of the airplane? What's the rest of the condition of the airplane? And the reason my concern for that is back in 2012, Boeing started removing inspection operations off their jobs. So it left the mechanics to buy off their own work. So what we're seeing with the door plug blowout is what I've seen with the rest of the airplane, as far as jobs not being completed properly, inspection steps being removed, issues being ignored. My concerns are with the 737 and the 787, because those programs have really embraced the theory that quality is overhead and non-value added. So those two programs have really put a strong effort into removing quality from the process. When I first started working at Charleston, I was in charge with pushing back defects to our suppliers. And what that meant was I'd take a group of inspectors and actually go to the supplier and inspect their product before they sent it in. Well, I'd taken a team of 4 inspectors to Spirit Aerosystems to inspect the 41 section before they sent it to Charleston. And we found 300 defects. Some of them were significant that needed engineering intervention. When I returned to Charleston, my senior manager told me that we had found too many defects and he was going to take the next trip. So the next trip he went on, he took 2 of my inspectors. And when they got back, they were given accolades for only finding 50 defects. So I pulled that inspector aside and I said, did Spirit really clean up their act that quick? That don't sound right. And she was mad. She said, no. Said the 2 inspectors were given 2 hours to inspect the whole 41 section and they were kicked off the airplane.
Doesn't sound great. Doesn't sound great. And then that guy found dead in his car. Now, I don't know. I mean, you're talking about Boeing. You're talking about big-time military-industrial complex. I mean, listen, you want to say bad things about pharma, you might lose your job, and you might, you might get taken down from the internet. You might get shadow banned. You might have a hard time getting your information out into the world. But you start talking shit on the defense contractors, and you are playing a different game, my friends. I mean, sure, is it possible that he just Clintoned himself in the backseat, just suicided himself? Of course. Anything's possible. We have no idea what happened in this, but talk about a juicy story. Seeing all these things in the news, problems with the planes, and you get a whistleblower who's a part of the court case found dead in his car. Really does seem like some movie shit.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Now, people are upset that, well, the Chinese, I think when you go on TikTok in China, I think the kids are shown, more sophisticated or more intelligent information or something like that. But in America, it's dumbed down. Well, I don't think that's because of propaganda. They're just appealing to Americans because that's what Americans want. I mean, Americans have already been dumbed down by our educational system, our government schools. It's not the Chinese government that's responsible for the poor academic performance of American youth. And the fact that the content on TikTok seems to be tailored to a much lower intellect than in China. Well, of course, the Chinese are doing a much better job educating their kids than the Americans are. So the content just happens to fit the market, right? We're a pretty dumb market. I mean, the average American teen, I mean, my God. So this content appeals to them. It's not that China is dumbing us down. We've already been dumbed down. And so we're just getting the content that we deserve. That is the problem. The solution is not to ban TikTok, but let's ban these government schools. Let's get the government out of education. Let's have the private sector educating our kids, not the government. That would be a solution to this problem. If you're worried about our children being brainwashed and indoctrinated, get them out of the public schools. That would actually help. I don't care if they want to use TikTok. Let's liberate them from those government schools with a voucher system or however they want to do it. But of course, that's not going to happen. They're going to resist that. Now, I mentioned a little earlier that I thought there was a tie-in between gold and TikTok. Because if the Senate approves this TikTok ban, which the House has already approved, and which President Biden has already said he will sign, right, assuming he can remember how to do that, but this is going to pass. And after it passes, what is China going to do? We're now telling the Chinese government, hey, we don't want this company. You can't operate this company in our country. I mean, are they going to retaliate? I would think so. I mean, I don't think they want to lose face here. I mean, they're our biggest supplier and our biggest banker. So it's like, oh, so all of these products, you can have all these Chinese products, but TikTok's not welcome. Oh, and we can owe trillions of your treasuries. We're allowed to buy all the treasuries we want, but your citizens can't even download our app. I think the way they may retaliate, and again, I'm not advocating this. I'm just pointing out their position, what they could do if they were smart. And I assume that they are smart, right? If they want to hit America where it hurts, they don't have to ban any of our products, right? It's not like, they just start selling our treasuries. They sell our dollars, which they're already doing. They just step it up. I mentioned that gold sold off after we got the hotter than expected inflation numbers, but it rallied back today, gained back most of what it lost. Bonds also sold off yesterday, and then they sold off again today to add to yesterday's losses. So that already shows me, again, that the investors are starting to figure it out. More of them will, and the moves are going to be bigger, that the inflation fight is over only because inflation won and the government conceded. And that is bearish for bonds, and that is bullish for gold. But if the Chinese decide that the way they want to retaliate is by selling dollars and treasuries faster and then buying more gold, which they have a short window of opportunity. Where is that window of opportunity? It's coming from the liquidations out of the GLD. So while Americans are foolishly selling off their gold to buy Bitcoin ETFs, that gives the Chinese a window of opportunity to unload their treasuries and buy that gold. And that is a great swap for China because they get rid of paper and they get real gold. Meanwhile, Americans get the short end of the stick. They sell their gold and get digital nothing. But I think the Chinese will probably try to take advantage of this. And so what does this mean for Americans? If the Chinese do what I'm saying they could do, and it's in their interest, so they should do it, it's going to hurt America. It's going to hurt America a lot more than banning TikTok is going to hurt China. Because if China really starts divesting of its dollars and treasuries and buys gold, what is that going to do to the value of the US dollar? What is that going to do to consumer prices and interest rates here in the United States? It's going to send them much higher. So in addition to not being able to use TikTok, Americans are going to pay higher prices for everything they need to buy, and they're going to be paying higher interest rates if they need to borrow the money to buy it. So again, we are completely underestimating the Chinese position in this ridiculous battle that shouldn't even be fought. But again, I think the government is just using this ruse of the animosity that people have to this Chinese boogeyman to dupe us into surrendering our rights. Right? That's always how the government usurps more power. They get us to fear something, and they say that we need more government to protect us from this contrived threat. And so that's what they've done. And that's what Congress is signing on to. At least Trump, who originally talked favorably about banning TikTok, has now done a 180, and he says that we shouldn't do it. So at least he's evolved that position in the proper direction. What the source of that 180, I don't know. Maybe it's legitimate, genuine. He thought about it. But this Congress is going to pass it. So again, this is bad news for America. It's bad news for American liberties, just like the tariffs. Trump puts the tariffs on China. China doesn't pay the tariffs. Americans pay the tariffs. It's a tax on Americans. And the ban on TikTok is not a ban on China. It's a ban on Americans. It prevents Americans from using a Chinese product, but it opens up the door for the government to ban Americans from using all sorts of products. And it sets a very bad precedent that ultimately will be abused and exploited.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
I interviewed Paul Gottfried on my show. He's a absolutely great guy. I love him. And he's like a litmus test that I use. Like if somebody likes Paul Gottfried, I figure it's probably a good guy, So I asked him, I said, for years and years, we hear, every 4 years, this is the most important election in American history, right? This one right here. And then 4 years later, it's going to be that one. And there's never going to be one where they say, this one, I could kind of take or leave. It's always the most important. But I said, but is there a chance? I mean, it's like the boy who cried wolf. Remember, there eventually was a wolf at the end of the story. There could well be. We could get to a point where this is the most important election in our lifetimes or ever. And I said, how do you think about that claim for the 2024 election? And he said, I actually think it is. I actually think it is, because if you don't change course now, there are all these bad things, starting from the lawfare all on down. There's so many bad things that could happen that it could indeed be unrecoverable after this. And he says that as a guy who in the primary period was not rooting for Trump, thinks Trump is a very, very flawed guy, but he doesn't hate his guts, at least. He doesn't hate Paul Gottfried's guts. And in 2024, that's about the best you can expect. And maybe he could hold off the hordes for 4 more years till a better guy comes along. So that was his argument. Now, you, meanwhile, are not just you. I mean, I've also been, interested in the fate of the LP. But somebody might legitimately ask Dave Smith, look, at a time like this, when there are all kinds of existential threats to the America that we once knew that may be gone forever, how can you luxuriate in your, well, I'm above all this, I'm going to vote for the Libertarian nominee when I know that person's not going to win, and meanwhile, I could have voted for somebody more likely to win who could stop what is certainly going to happen to us if the Democrats win again. It's a common question. You heard it a million times, but, it's a legitimate question. How do you answer it?
Well, I mean, look, it's almost like, to me, when it's not, my position is not that, and I hate some of these slogans that people in the Libertarian Party make. It's not like, I won't vote for the lesser of two evils or something. I think that's stupid. Like, I definitely would vote for the lesser of two evils in many situations. Like, I would vote for a 10% income tax over a 90% income tax, and I think that's the lesser of two evils. But if there was a referendum on that, I'd certainly vote for the 10% tax. So it's not that, and it's not. I'm not like saying I'm not. I don't think I'm making the perfect the enemy of the good. It's that I look at it more in a situation where it's like you're bleeding out and you're going to die. And they're like, well, one guy has a Band-Aid and the other guy doesn't have anything. So wouldn't you at least vote for the one guy with the Band-Aid? And you're like, a Band-Aid is irrelevant at this point. This is not going to do anything. And Donald Trump, he's got 4 years on the record. And I just see no reason that he won't just get completely rolled and maybe even accelerate this plan. Donald Trump's 4 years culminated in 2020. And he has demonstrated over and over again that he has not learned anything from it. He's just bragging about Operation Warp Speed the other day on Truth Social. He was stuff, Tom. He was demonizing Sweden into the summer for them not being locked down in the summer of 2020, that is. And then also I just think that people get a little bit mystical when they talk about politics and government, because of course, as we kind of know, like the whole thing doesn't exist in a sense. Like in a sense it does, but in another sense it doesn't. It's a social construct. But look, I live in like a red country town, but I live in a very blue state. My vote, whether I voted for Donald Trump or voted for Michael Rechtenwald or whoever, it's a protest vote either way. I know the way my state's going. I'm not, you know what I mean? So if I'm going to protest vote, let me protest vote with who I actually agree with. And, my concern with all of this stuff is like, as I said to Bob Murphy the other day, I'm a Ron Paulian. I believe in spreading ideas. I believe in spreading a message and speaking to the remnant. That's the business I'm in. And if somebody else has some plan where Donald Trump's going to get in there and actually efficiently wield power in order to like hold off this globalist agenda, it's like, all right, well, he certainly didn't seem too good at wielding power last time. I mean, the guy got framed for treason for 4 years and not a single person who framed him got in trouble. One FBI agent, I think the guy who misled the FISA courts got a conviction with no jail time, I believe, but that's it. And so, I don't know, I'm just not seeing it. But again, if you're telling me you want to support Donald Trump, okay, I understand the arguments for rejecting Joe Biden. That's for sure.
Well, we're Big Tent here on the Tom Woods Show. We can all agree on that.
What did we talk about yesterday? TikTok?
Yeah, we were on right when the House voted.
And, it came on late and exploded. Yeah. And now it's continued to explode. But I look at it as these people who want to pass this rule where we can kick TikTok out. Yeah. They're excited like, we just stopped World War III. Yeah. It would be so dangerous. It's national security. So anyway, but on more digestion of this, there's more and more people speaking out. And there's not many people changing their mind to being, against this bill. The amount of votes on there was tremendous to support this. But once again, the speed of how some of the big things happen, we revisit so often. What happened on 9/11? Within days, they had the Patriot Act. Well, when did they write it up? When did they have hearings? When did they have any votes? None of that, and it was prepared, so the time came, and they used it. This is a little bit like that, there was this discussion going on, but all of a sudden, it was an absolute emergency, and then the votes were there.
House Democrats will attempt to force a vote on the $95 billion war bill. Now, maybe there's a component to this that we're missing out on, Dr. Paul, but I'm slightly disappointed in Representative Jim McGovern because you worked with him a lot. Has been a good progressive. You can leave that up. But apparently he is working to do a discharge petition to get that aid bill on the floor, to get that $61 billion to Ukraine, $14 billion to Israel, a bunch of money to Taiwan for warmongering. He's going to force Johnson's hand to get it to the floor.
So he's representing the position that we give more money for war and none to protect our borders?
Yeah, he wants to get that bill to the floor. He wants to pass the aid bill
without
the borders. Yeah,
without the border money.
Yeah.
And that's the really that's a bigger issue. If you just go out and poll a lot of people in this country, and say, yeah, we should do it. That's how some of this discussion started. Was we keep sending more and more, and we're running out of money for Ukraine. And what are you doing about the borders? And well, if somebody gets in there and does it, they'll say, oh, well, we need umpteen number of billions of dollars again. Yeah. But it's in motion right now. Although I do not accept this idea because I heard at every election, I think I can remember, this is the most important election ever. Well, it is important, and it could turn out to be a little bit more important, but the whole thing is the same old stuff. It's the bad guys that are dishonest, don't believe in truth, they don't believe really, and they don't understand the Constitution. Do you follow the Constitution? How often have you ever voted for something that was not explicitly authorized in the Constitution? There's hardly anything that they pass that it's not explicitly. That's why I thought a moratorium ought to be on all new stuff, and that we elect a group of people, throw them all out, and give them 4 years to improve things only by repealing.
Yeah, that's
get rid of the bad stuff. Boy, one day somebody have a grand day removing all the regulation. See, that's not legislation. Yeah, it's legislation. Illegal legislation should have never been passed.
That should put you in charge of that. That would take care of a lot of problems.
XX.
Well, the last thing I saw just before we went online here is that apparently Speaker Johnson met with some members of the Senate to talk about this bill. And here's the way it looks like it might be moving. We're not sure, it's not confirmed, but it looks like what he's going to do to get around this is he's going to say, well, this isn't aid, this is a loan. They're going to pay us back. Ukraine's going to pay us back. The country is decimated. They lost half their population, but they're going to, it's like those student loans. They're going to pay us back. Don't worry about it.
Good examples, too. And they pay their interest and everything else. Yeah. And who really gets filed up there are the people who were talked into taking these loans or were forced to take the loan, and they're very sincere and honest within a system that's really messy. They go and they do this, and they cannot pay. They don't pay the bills back. So the people who either stayed out of the system and worked hard, you could have two 18-year-olds and one borrows all the money and gets a job and finally gets that degree that didn't do him any good. And then you take somebody else that's worked all that time. The person that maybe worked without the education, but he worked hard, their penalty is great.
Yeah.
It's not a very good system.
No, it's not. But apparently, so from this meeting, talking about making it a loan, which is just trying to put lipstick on the pig, but also he did not mention, according to someone who was in the meeting, did not mention the border with Mexico when he met with the senators. And the article also quoted Senator John Cornyn, who is from the deep state, masquerading as a Texan, and he said that he heard Speaker Johnson say, we will not leave Ukraine empty-handed or something like that. So clearly now it looks to me at least like this is going to move as well.
Bad news for the American taxpayer and for the concept of liberty, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
But we're not giving it up.
We're not giving it up.
Because there's all those tools and technology that are being used against us. But we shouldn't fear that technology that China has and they can use. We should fear the authoritarianism of a government.
Yes.
And I think the founders were pretty astute to say all enemies, foreign and domestic, and they knew about that. But right now, the domestic concerns are just flipped down as a little political chicaneries and fighting over, and it's pure politics that doesn't amount to real issues. I think they on purpose pass things quickly because they don't want to hear that discussion.
Yeah. Well, I'm just looking at our comments here, and Joshua Clement said, first TikTok, then the Ron Paul Liberty Report. And it sounds funny, but it's not that far from the truth. They just designate you a bad guy, and then you're gone. So,
see, there are some people concerned about what's going on, and they're all our friends.
Well, now, what are your duties in their content, according to the Stoics? Well, their basic answer is live in accordance with your nature, with your reason, which is a typically Greek answer. But, of course, your nature is to be a fragment, and therefore what your reason tells you is nothing like what the other schools say. I'll mention two characteristic Stoic duties, which in their opinion are commandments of human reason. Number one, the duty of acceptance. Accept whatever happens to you, without wanting it to be different. Do not burn with passion for the things you haven't got. Do not feel anger or rebellion or protest against the state of affairs you're in, or the kind of world you're in, or the social circumstances you're in. Take the course of events as it comes, yield unprotestingly to whatever occurs. Do not lead events as it goes, as the saying goes, but follow them. Why this as a duty? Well, to protest would be impious. It would be rebellion against God. since everything is part of his plan. And of course, remember also the teleology. Everything is for the best. So if your wife gets run over by a truck, if you could see it all from God's point of view, you would see that it's all for the best, and therefore it's senseless to get upset over. And anyway, everything is inevitable. Your wife has been run over an infinite number of times by that same truck. So it's ridiculous. And then, of course, there is what you can call the Grand Canyon argument, although that isn't the name that the Stoics gave to it. But that's the idea, look at the vastness of the universe, the enormous number of events in the huge span of eternity. What does your particular life and petty cares matter in the face of this? That's I call the Grand Canyon argument, because people usually recite it when they see the Grand Canyon. Now, all of these reasons, the wise man will tranquilly accept everything. And that's, of course, what we mean by a Stoic today when you call somebody stoical. He will see that everything is inevitable, that all is for the best, that nothing external is worth having anyway, that so long as he does his duty and accepts, he has everything worth having, inner tranquility, wisdom, or virtue. To achieve this state, of course, he must constantly will down the enemy, his passions. He must discipline himself. He must see how his desires and aversions are simply nonsense in the face of God's inevitable unfolding. And if he schools himself in this, says the Stoics, one day, if he's really steeped himself in the right metaphysics and the right self-discipline, in a sudden conversion, all of his emotions will fall away from him, and he will be truly insensible. Now, it's hard to do this. It takes a process of constant willpower and self-discipline. But given enough time, they thought it can be done. Once you do it, you are truly invulnerable. Now you value only what's in your power. Only the state of doing your duty, i.e. virtue. That is really, in the last analysis, the only thing worth having if you're to be secure and independent of the world. Thus, the idea, which we know in the expression virtue, is an end in itself. Virtue is its own reward. Everything else is inconsequential: life, wealth, health, fame, you name it. And you see the similarity to Epicurus in this withdrawal, except that the Stoic withdrawal from life is much greater than Epicurus's. Epicurus withdraws into a garden. The Stoic withdraws into his own soul, where nothing can touch him, into being virtuous as an end in itself, simply for the sake of doing his duty. That, he thinks, is just up to him alone, not dependent on a hostile world. And therefore we have an even greater renunciation of life than we did with Epicurus. Now, besides the duty of acceptance, there is a second duty I'll mention, and that is, we'll conclude our discussion of the Stoic duties. So far, via acceptance, complete passivity in action would be sufficient. Simply wipe out your emotions, keep yourself attuned to God's plan, don't desire or protest, be apathetic. And a few advocated a kind of passive state of this sort. But most of the Stoics gave a positive content to your duty, requiring definite action and not simply passive acceptance. What kind of action did they advocate? Altruistic action, serving others, doing your duty to promote the welfare of mankind. What was their reasoning here? Well, again, they based it on the idea you're just a part of a whole. Just as you're a part of God and not metaphysically autonomous, and therefore have duties to God and should not seek your own advantage, so in relation to mankind, you're only a part. In relation to you, mankind is a much larger fragment of God. And by the same reasoning that the whole is superior to the part, you owe an allegiance to humanity. And besides, of course, it's hopeless to achieve any advantages for yourself in this world. As a Stoic, you are insensible, so no personal self-interest or private goals are possible anyway. If you're not to vegetate, all that's left is service to others. And here I'll give you a quote from Epictetus. Quote, they use always the bodily analogies. Quote, a foot, for instance, I will allow it is natural should be clean. But if you take it as a foot, and as a thing which does not stand by itself, it will beseem it, if need be, to walk in the mud, to tread on thorns, and sometimes even to be cut off for the benefit of the whole body. Else it is no longer a foot. In some such way we should conceive of ourselves also. What art thou? A man. Looked at standing by thyself and separate, it is natural for thee, in health and wealth, long to live. But looked at as a man, and only as a part of a whole, it is for that whole's sake that thou shouldst at one time fall sick, at another brave the perils of the sea, again know the meaning of want, and perhaps die an early death. Why then repine? Knowest thou not that as the foot is no more a foot if detached from the body, so thou in like case are no longer a man? Unquote from Epictetus. And one more, which makes the point very clear from Epictetus. Quote, what then does the character of a citizen imply? To hold no private interest, to deliberate of nothing as a separate individual, but rather like the hand or the foot, which, if they had reason and comprehended the constitution of nature, would never pursue or desire but with a reference to the whole. Hence the philosophers rightly say that, if it were possible for a wise and good man to foresee what was to happen, he might cooperate in bringing on himself sickness and death and mutilation, being sensible that these things are appointed in the order of the universe, and that the whole is superior to a part, and the city to the citizen. Unquote. Now that is certainly unequivocal. Now, of course, the ground and essence of this viewpoint is in Plato, as we saw it in Plato's organic theory of the state. But in Plato, to some serious extent, moral virtue was justified by the happiness it would lead to. You remember Plato, although he was very mixed on this question, his argument against the sophists was, if you behave your way, you will be miserable, you'll have a sick soul. Now, however, the openly religious metaphysics of the Stoics, combined with the deep sense of futility about the achievement of any personal goals on earth, has led for the first time to altruism as an official, cardinal, explicit duty, not to be justified even in the name of your own long-run self-interest. Now, I hasten to point out that the Stoics, as always, are inconsistent on this point. They often say that altruism leads to your own happiness, but that is not their distinctive viewpoint. That's simply their Greek legacy.
Taiwan confirms that U.S. troops are in Kinmen. And if you remember where Kinmen is a group of Taiwanese-controlled islands that are on the coast of mainland China, just a few miles from the coast of mainland China. Taiwanese Defense Minister Xu Kuo-cheng confirmed on Thursday the presence of U.S. Army Special Forces soldiers in Kinmen, and some parts of the Kinmen Islands are just 2.5 miles away from the mainland Chinese city of Xiamen, just 2.5 miles away. And the presence of U.S. troops on these islands was first reported by Taiwanese media last month. If you remember, I covered it because this is a big deal. I mean, you try to put the shoe on the other foot in these scenarios. I can't think of anything comparable, I guess, besides Chinese troops being right over the border in Canada or Mexico or something like that. So Chu confirmed the highly provocative deployment when he was asked about a new report from the U.S. outlet SOFREP that said U.S. Green Berets have taken up permanent positions as military advisors in Kinmen. The U.S. soldiers are also deployed in Penghui, which is a Taiwanese-controlled archipelago about 30 miles west of Taiwan and 70 miles east of mainland China. So further away than Kinmen, obviously, but still not too far across the Taiwan Strait. So this new report from this U.S. outlet, SOFREP, said that the U.S. Green Berets were stationed at the Taiwanese Army's amphibious command centers and that this deployment was carried out under provisions in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, which called for the U.S. to create a comprehensive training program for the Taiwanese military. The new collaboration includes the U.S. troops training Taiwanese forces on the Black Hornet Nano, which is a compact military drone. So these drones are really small. They can fit in the palm of your hand. So that's just the only example, really, of the type of training that they're doing. So Taiwan's defense minister said that the presence of the U.S. Green Berets was a learning opportunity for Taiwan's military. So this follows a pattern of the U.S. increasing its support for Taiwan, its troop deployments to Taiwan. And I mean, this is just, again, like, what is the purpose of this besides just being incredibly provocative, just to be a tripwire for a potential war? Because if China does decide to invade Taiwan or attack Taiwan, the battle is going to open probably on these islands. And there were battles over these islands in the 1950s during the first and second Taiwan Strait crisis. And during those, the U.S. intervened and sent its Navy fleet through the Taiwan Strait. So there's a history here. And it's just, I don't know, it just seems reckless and insane to me, and it doesn't get much media attention, so I wanted to make it the top story here. Israeli military announced that it plans to relocate the 1.5 million Palestinians taking refuge in Rafah to what they call humanitarian islands. So this is from Israel's chief military spokesman, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari. He said, quote, "We need to make sure that 1.4 million people, or at least a significant amount of the 1.4 million, will move. Where? To humanitarian islands that we will create with the international community," end quote. So it looks like they're saying that they're going to clear Rafah out and forcibly move these people. Where exactly is not clear. And this sounds like, they say that they'll create this with the international community. That sounds like they want the U.S. to pay for whatever this sort of plan is. And then, of course, there's the risk of Israel bombing these areas anyway, as they have bombed many of these areas that they have deemed as so-called safe zones. So Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi vowed on Thursday that the Yemeni group would expand its targeting of Israel-linked commercial shipping to hit vessels in the Indian Ocean that are trying to get around the Red Sea. Al-Houthi said, quote, "Our main battle is to prevent ships linked to the Israeli enemy from passing through not only the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, and the Gulf of Aden, but also the Indian Ocean towards the Cape of Good Hope. This is a major step, and we have begun to implement our operations related to it," end quote. So this goes to show, I'm not sure the range of Houthi missiles, how far in the Indian Ocean that they can hit, because he's talking about ships that will go around below Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope to avoid the Red Sea. But this goes to show how this new U.S. bombing campaign against the Houthis has done nothing to deter them. And, they keep escalating their attacks on commercial shipping. And U.S. officials have acknowledged that they don't know how much damage they're doing to the Houthis. They really have no idea. But despite the lack of success, they continue to bomb Yemen. There was fresh U.S. airstrikes, 11 U.S. airstrikes reported in Yemen's Hodeidah province on Thursday. There were some strikes the day before as well. Al-Houthi said that U.S. military action will not stop them from supporting Gaza, and he vowed that the attacks would continue until the Israeli onslaught in Gaza comes to an end, and that is what the Houthis, or Ansar Allah, have said this whole time. And he also said that the U.S. and British involvement is only going to widen the conflict and war at the regional level. Al-Houthi also said that 34 Houthis have been killed since Ansar Allah began targeting Israel-linked commercial shipping in response to the slaughter in Gaza. And according to the Yemen Data Project, at least 1 civilian was killed and 10 have been wounded by U.S. and British airstrikes.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Markets today were down. Wholesale inflation went up higher than they thought. Gold prices went down. Oil. You got Brent crude now at about $85 a barrel. What happened? Ukraine attacked a major oil refinery in Russia. Read your Trends Journal. Week after 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 week. It's a weekly. The grand total of $2.56 a week. Basically nothing. And again, golden year for gold. One of your top trends, World War III. Top trends, EV, go FU, all on the mark. So, going back to oil. We've been warning that oil prices are going to escalate dramatically as, not if, as the Middle East and Ukraine war keeps expanding. And our warning or forecasting that with Ukraine losing the dough that they need, they're going to ramp up attacks inside Russia. There you got it. And you haven't seen anything yet as the Israel war keeps expanding, which we will get back to. And gold prices took a bit of a hit today, but they're still way up there, and we see them staying up. So here's your deal. Inflation is going up as economies are going down. Japan, UK, Germany in recession. Again, inflation's going up. It is not stagflation. The economies are going down. We are going to go through a period of dragflation. I'm not talking about, LGBT. I'm talking about that kind of drag, Dragflation meaning economies go down and inflation goes up. U.S. finds spare cash to provide weaponry to Ukraine. The numbers are between $300 and $400 million. Spare cash. EU, $5 billion to fund arms for Kyiv. Anyway, it keeps going on. Detainees from Gaza say Israelis stripped and beat them. This is a whole big article in the Wall Street Journal. The atrocities that are being committed. Hey, but America, that's okay. We got Guantanamo. This is nothing. Come on. What are you going after them for? And as I said, and as we warned with one of our top trends for 2023, Middle East meltdown, when we warned that this would happen this year, Israel's clashes with Hezbollah intensify. This is from the Financial Times. Cross-border fire between Israel and Hezbollah has escalated sharply as Israeli jets twice struck targets deep inside Lebanon in the past 48 hours. This is yesterday being reported. You ready? And the militant group responded with a single largest barrage of rockets since the start of the hostilities in October. Militants responded. Okay. Israel bombs the shit out of Lebanon, and the people of Lebanon respond to getting bombed, and they're called militants. And that's why you subscribe to the Trends Journal. We're not media whores that get paid to put out by the corporate pimps and the government whoremasters. How disgusting to write like this. How disgusting to write like this. How about they retaliated? Hey, in the Bronx, we used to say, payback's a bitch. You bastards. Oh, Neri Ziba in Tel Aviv reported on this. Yeah, okay, there you go. China calls for immediate ceasefire as Gaza conflict defies Ramadan. This is from the Global Times. I want to read this. Quote, the killing of Gaza civilians must stop. The injustice toward the Palestinian people must be corrected. And the double standards in dealing with human rights and international humanitarian law must be abandoned. The longer the flames of Gaza flare up, the more the humanity is scourged by conscience, the more the cornerstone of justice is eroded. And that was according to their foreign minister. Perfectly true. And Poland's foreign minister confirms NATO troops are in Ukraine. And as I said, Poland says that we have to prepare for the next war. And Poland, the biggest army in the EU, and they go on to say that the Polish minister said this week that he said, quote, several NATO countries already have their troops in Ukraine. This is Guy Sikorsky. He said the West should pursue the policy of asymmetrical escalation in Ukraine. And then in the Wall Street Journal today, Putin rattles nuclear saber. He's saying if it's going to go nuclear, we're going to go nuclear. Again, World War III has begun. People have no clue about how bad it is. China, Iran, Russia, this is the Global Times of China, launched joint drills near Gulf of Oman. Safeguard regional maritime security. China warns of conflict over U.S. push for major country contest. Keeps going on.
This story that just came out is what got me thinking about this. So let's go to Rand Paul's tweet.
I don't believe today, as I'm sitting here, that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee in 2024. Don't believe it.
I don't think it's helpful for the President of the United States to attack the media. It's petty, and it's certainly below the stature of the office of the President of the United States. It's beneath the office in and of itself.
Actions and activities unbecoming of the office of the President of the United States.
All right. So this is, of course, Mike Rogers. You saw some clips there from my old show, SEC Cups, Unfiltered. So why is Rand Paul playing this video of Mike Rogers? Because Donald Trump just came out and endorsed him. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, is Donald Trump just saying that a corrupt CIA stooge of a senator is better than a corrupt CIA stooge who's a Democrat? So he's just picking the Republican because they're that's his team and maybe they're a little bit better on the margins than a Democrat? No, he's doing this in Mike Rogers' primary against Justin Amash, who's also seeking the Senate seat. Now, Justin Amash is 500 trillion million times better than Mike Rogers. And anyone who knows the first thing about anything cannot deny that. But Justin Amash, and while I'll be the first one to admit he was wrong for this, but he voted for impeachment, Donald Trump. He came out after the Mueller investigation or something and said he was guilty of obstruction of justice. Now, that was a bad take by Justin Amash. I'm not defending him on that. But aside from that, his voting record in the House was so good. I mean, he's easily one of the greatest congressmen to ever live. I would probably rank, I would certainly rank Ron Paul as number one. I think Thomas Massey might take that number 2 slot, but Justin Amash is right there arguing for number 3. I mean, he's up there amongst the greatest congressmen to ever live. But he hurt Donald Trump's ego. He came out against Donald Trump. And so Donald Trump, and you know, Rob, this is not because he thinks Rogers is better for the country than Justin Amash. There's no chance that that's the case. But he'll come out against him. So we could have one of the greatest congressmen in the history of this country in the Senate. We could have another Rand Paul in the Senate. But the most influential right-winger in America by far is going to come out and try to make it so we don't have that because his ego is hurt. And that's who Donald Trump is. In a nutshell, you could not sum him up better than that. So no, thank you. I'm not going to support that. Look, I live in a little country town. My town's red, but I live in a blue state. And it's a foregone conclusion who's going to win my state anyway. My vote is just a protest vote anyway. So if I'm going to protest vote, let me at least protest vote for something I actually believe in. Protest vote for this guy who's going to try. Literally, look, I'm not saying adding one more Rand Paul in the Senate saves our country tomorrow. But yeah, it maybe pulls that car back from 110 miles an hour to 109 miles an hour. Like, okay, that's at least something. We can at least get one more good senator in there. But no, you're going to work against that just because it's not glorifying your ego, which is, by the way, all this whole thing is about anyway. It's the whole thing, right? I didn't lose last time. I won last time. And now I got to go show everybody that I won and we're going to win again. And then he'll talk about how we won. Nobody thought we were going to win, but we won. Well, it'll just be that. So anyway, that in a nutshell is my response to that. I'm not making the perfect the enemy of the good. I'm just saying, show me the good. I need something before I could be convinced to do this.
Well, I guess that Rogers guy trashed him too, so he's picking between who was trashing him.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So to speak to your point, I mean, he put deep state kooks in once he got in there. He ousted his team and he replaced him with all your war hungry Boltons and other individuals. With that said, and I agree with you, if you're in a state that's going in one direction anyways, voting for the Libertarian Party to get counted as, hey, these are the ideals that I care more about is probably better for representation because it puts some numbers to how many people care about these ideas. And, you know, as they start trying to plan for other elections and research what ideas they need to actually platform, higher numbers for that is important. With that said, I really hope that Biden loses and he loses big. And I do think that Trump does I agree with you. Trump's probably going to put bad war people into his cabinet. I think on some of these huge issues, such as Israel, he's going to be no better. Yeah. But I do think when it comes in rolling back bad investments in green energy, when it comes to pushing the woke agenda, when it comes to internet free speech and, talking to the networks directly to try and deplatform people like us, and when it comes to trying to push things like a central bank digital currency, I think on some of these other, which are more just national issues, Trump is definitely better than Biden. And
I will agree that he's less worse than Biden on several issues. I don't know that his own deep state may not be trying to do a lot of this stuff even when Donald Trump's in there. I think we've clearly established they don't work for him even when he's president. But you are right. There's areas in terms of energy regulation, he was much better than Joe Biden. He did get some tax cuts in there that were good. Would have liked to see them a lot steeper and on this particularly on the individual
didn't spend
side.
any less.
Yeah. So government spending, he was atrocious. It was an absolute disaster.
Tomorrow in history, March 16th, I believe 1751, James Madison was born. So we're celebrating James Madison's birthday. And I know many people know him as the father of the Constitution, but it seems like very few people know his actual views on the Constitution and how to enforce it. And so for that, on this episode, we say happy birthday with a dirty dozen. For me, I've got my top 12 favorite quotes, at least for today, from Madison himself. From Federalist number 45, which I think is his best overview of the entire structure of the Constitution itself. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. This is a precursor, really, to what we got with the 10th Amendment. And proponents of the Constitution throughout the ratification debates explain the meaning of these various phrases. Now, there was some debate over them, but James Madison discussed many of them throughout his career, during ratification and well after as well. So, for example, let's look at some of the big clauses that are used, misused, and abused more than any others, like the General Welfare Clause. Here's Madison in the House of Representatives in 1792. He said, "It would be absurd to say that Congress may do what they please." And that's how people who love power have always treated clauses like this. They're looking at general welfare and they say, well, we can do whatever the heck we want. But Madison said that would be absurd. He said, in fact, the meaning of the general terms in question must either be sought in the subsequent enumerations which limits and details them, or they convert the government from one limited as hitherto supposed to the enumerated powers into a government without any limits at all. So to treat the General Welfare Clause as the Anything Everything Clause is to give them unlimited power. Now, discussing commerce, here's a letter to Joseph C. Cabell. He said, "It is very certain that it grew out of the abuse of the power by the importing states in taxing the non-importing, and it was intended as a negative and preventative provision against injustice among the states themselves, rather than as a power to be used for the positive purposes of the general government." This was not a tool to give the general or federal government a bunch of power over our everyday lives. We also have the Necessary and Proper Clause. Here's his speech, one of his speeches opposing the First National Bank. He said, "Whatever meaning this clause may have, none can be admitted that would give an unlimited discretion to Congress. Its meaning must, according to the natural and obvious force of the terms and the context, be limited to means necessary to the end and incident to the nature of the specified powers." Madison here is telling the people who understood this very well, at least at the time, that the Necessary and Proper Clause was based on the legal doctrine of principles and incidents. We've got a whole episode that we'll be linking to in the show notes discussing Madison's views on necessary and proper. And he wrapped up Federalist number 48 with this: "A mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hands." And he discusses who has the final say on this. In his report of 1800, discussing the Alien and Sedition Acts and the resolutions of Virginia passed in response to them in 1798, and he points out that the Constitution was formed by the sanction of the states, given by each in its sovereign capacity. And he also points out in this report that you can define the word states in many ways, including state governments, a particular land mass. But he says states in this capacity, it means the people composing those political societies in their highest sovereign capacity. Sovereignty means final authority to the founding generation. And Madison is saying that the people of the several states in their highest sovereign capacity, they are the ones that form the Constitution of the United States. And he said, the states then being the parties to the constitutional compact and in their sovereign capacity, it follows of necessity that there can be no tribunal above their authority to decide in the last resort whether the compact made by them be violated. Turning to the government, the creation, to determine if it violated the rules that the people of the several states gave to it when they created it, is a guarantee that that government power will always grow and grow and grow. Now, Madison didn't necessarily say you had to make this decision, this call in the states on every issue, but he certainly said in the last resort, they're the ones to decide, the people of the several states. And going back to his Virginia resolutions of 1798, he described it like this. In case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact, the states who are parties thereto have a right and are in duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. So to stop the feds, James Madison also told us all the way back in Federalist number 46 during the ratification debate 1788, he said very similar. He said that you have to have a disobedience by the people, outspoken governors, use state legislative devices, and, quote, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Now, he described things, there's different strategies for every specific issue. You can't apply the exact same thing in the exact same way, but certainly we know that according to James Madison in Federalist 46, in the Virginia resolutions, again, in his report of 1800, that going to the government to convince the government to stop doing what the government was never supposed to do in the first place is not how you deal with usurpations of power. It's really ultimately up to the people of the states to get the job done. And he said the right of nullification meant by Mr. Jefferson is the natural right, which all admit to be a remedy against insupportable oppression. So the right of nullification is not something that you get from a document. You don't have to get permission from anyone. This is a natural right. It's a revolutionary right in some ways as well. And everyone, he's saying everyone at the time of the founding actually admitted that this would be a remedy against insupportable oppression. This is also from his report of 1800. Again, all this will be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. He said the powers not given to the government were withheld from it, and that if any doubt could have existed on this subject, under the original text of the Constitution, it is removed as far as words could remove it by the 12th Amendment, which is now the 10th Amendment, now a part of the Constitution, which expressly declares that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people.
Well, thank you, Dr. Paul. And you should be a very proud father because Senator Rand Paul really is a champion of our civil liberties, the Bill of Rights. When it's the big stuff, when the rubber hits the road, he is always there, even by himself, defending us. And this week he said, regarding this TikTok, great quote, emulating Chinese communism is not the way to combat Chinese communism. What a radical idea. Don't be a commie yourself. Now, personally, I don't think Chinese communism has to be battled at all. What do I care? I'm 6,000 miles away. I'm an American. What do I care what kind of government they have all the way across the world? Let each nation choose their own form of government. I definitely don't want our government to be communist. And thank goodness, even though they're leaning in that direction, they're not communists. And I don't really care if San Francisco or New York City, if they want to live the way they live, knock yourself out. And so this whole battling communism is not really necessary. And if you look, like Dr. Paul said, if you look at China, they're pretty much communist in name only. They are some of the biggest, most powerful capitalists in the world. Now, we Americans, we're the capitalists. That's pretty much in name only. We're some of the biggest socialists in the world. But the point that Rand is making, and it's a wonderful point, is you're not going to defeat this bad ideology by adopting it yourself. You're going to censor people. You're going to, give the president this terrible power of saying they're foreign influence. That's it. Censor them. Even though 100 million Americans use their service, And this whole idea that China is coming to get us, when you look at a map, China is surrounded by U.S. military bases. Are we surrounded by Chinese military bases? Not at all. If anybody should be worried, it's them. And we say over and over, bring our troops home, bring our troops home. But, the American people are so propagandized that this is a very tough battle to fight. To advocate for freedom, that's why Rand is largely alone, because the propaganda is so effective on the American people that they think that they have the right to go tell people all the way around the world how they should live.
If you believe, or a lot of people do sincerely and even mistakenly, that, Israel's losing this PR fight here, what's going on, and the Palestinians have gained. They have larger crowds coming out, and it is an issue. It's not going to be silenced easily. So they are saying, well, what do? We have to silence them. That's not dealing with the problem. Why has there been, this war going on in the Middle East for decades, if not years, many years? And it's going to continue because outsiders are trying to settle it instead of the people that live there. But that is a big problem. But when Rand got into that thing last night with Fox, it was interesting to know that one person I happened to listen to. I didn't listen to everything that was on the internet this morning, but Sink Uyghur, who's a commentator. He happens to be a progressive, and I've been interviewed by him. And I always believed he was fair in his interview, but he came to Rand's defense. So because he admitted, he said, well, tactics might be off a little bit. I wouldn't have done it the same way. But he said Rand's absolutely correct on this, and it's a First Amendment issue. So that's worth looking at because it gives a lot of information, and that's in a video that's on the TV today. But I think the people are lining up and. They have to demonize somebody, and right now they have been working very hard at it to demonize China, of course Russia, and this will add fuel to the fire and make it even worse. But if you ever look at one of Rand's points was he had a lot of trouble with kill meat on Fox. He says, who do you think owns it? And Rand had a list of the stockholders that owned it, and they weren't all, and none of them were Chinese officials. There were even Americans owned some of this stock. So that's really what counts. So this is a game they play because they have to demonize people both for the money, because right now they're arguing, will they get money for the Middle East war? Are they going to get money for Ukraine? Are they going to get money for our border security here? Well, so far the two foreign benefits seem to have more strength and more likely to get it. But my guess is they're going to get into this is just a wild guess that they're going to get into this final stage, and they know they have to have this money passed. And I think they'll give it to the whole thing. They'll throw a token of it to the United States, as if we're the losers. The other three countries, Taiwan will get money and all, but we don't want to fund the wall, and that's where the real conflict is. But I just sort of think the way they do things up there is they'll at least give you the image that they took care of everybody and everybody's happy. But the more difficulties that we get into because of the bankruptcy we have and the bankruptcy of our ideas, the less likely it will be to just paper it over, give them more money, give everybody money. Not when you have a debt of $34 trillion and playing havoc with our middle class and the poor. That spells trouble, and it's coming quickly.
And we live in a disordered nation. It's sad to see. It's sad to see our nation go down like this, but it is a reflection of disordered individuals. COVID was a big wake-up call to see the types of people that we live around. There's a lot of petty tyrants out there that were ready to stick a mask on you, weren't letting you in the house unless you took a shot that didn't work. I mean, we have a lot of petty tyrants that live under this big disordered tyranny that lives in Washington. So the place to start is on our own lives, get our own lives in order as best as we can, and at best, you can set an example for other people to try to mimic you. And that's what our nation should do. At best, try to set an example for China and Vietnam and South Korea. Just set an example, and maybe they'll adopt what you're doing. This idea of you being a busybody and you're going to try to control them is failing. We're bankrupting ourselves. So it's time to turn around and get back to first principles, like Dr. Paul said. It's very simple. It's in the U.S. Constitution, and it's in the Bill of Rights.
Now, I should point out that the Stoics, even though they advocated altruism, are often accused with some validity of really down deep being egoists. And the argument is as follows. The Stoics are really primarily motivated by the desire to achieve a sense of their personal individual moral virtue. They don't really sympathize with others in trouble, i.e. they don't burn with pity or love for suffering mankind. Since they're Stoics, they remain emotionally aloof, cold, uninvolved, apathetic. What then is their real interest in helping others? Well, the critics answer, to give the Stoic a chance to exercise his moral muscle. In effect, to do what's duty and thus gain the selfish sense that he has been virtuous. So their real goal is selfish after all. Now, this argument is valid. It simply shows that even the most Platonist Greeks had some tie to reality and to reason. If you contrast this Stoic approach with the later Kantian approach, you will see that point, because on Kant's view, if you are motivated even by the desire to achieve a sense of your own virtue, that fact alone deprives you of all moral credit for your action, because you still have a personal egoistic desire. If you get this contrast, you'll see how comparatively innocent any Greek, including even the Stoics, were on these points. And one final point on the Stoic ethics. As is typical of any duty approach to morality, the Stoics stress the importance of motive, your inner motive, as the measure of your morality, rather than your actual achievements in action in the world. All duty moralities, of whatever kind, hold that since morality has no existential goal or reward, but consists in selfless obedience to duty, the essence of the moral man is his inner compliance with virtue, and that his attainments in actual reality are secondary or unimportant. Now, those of you who know Kant will recognize how deeply he was influenced by the centuries of Stoicism and Christianity on this point. Of course, from an Aristotelian, non-duty viewpoint, this emphasis on the primacy of motive is a fundamental error, because on a non-duty viewpoint, you'll say, the purpose of morality is to achieve some goal in action in the world, whether happiness or life or whatever it happens to be. And you'll say the moral man is the one who acts in the right way to achieve this end in actual fact. His motives are important, only because motives lead to action, so you will give primacy to action. But on a duty approach, you'll reverse the order of priorities and say, it's not what you actually do in life that's so important, but your inner allegiance to duty, your motive. And action is important only as an expression of the right motive. Now, this idea of the primacy of motive over action is typically Stoic and has been highly influential on subsequent ethics, particularly the Christian Kantian schools, as I'm sure you can see. In general, to sum up their ethics, the Stoics preached an ascetic morality with dutiful, altruistic insensibility as the essence of the good life. For the record, you are allowed three emotions: joy at the beauty of the universe, as a testament to God's goodness; hope to become virtuous; fear of becoming vicious. As you see, this is hardly what you could describe as an extensive emotional life. Now let us say a word in conclusion about the Stoics' distinctive approach to politics. Because on this issue, the Stoics did have one crucial contribution to make. They were the first major school in Western philosophy to grasp and to preach what we can call the metaphysical equality of all men. And I'm using that concept roughly as I explained it in the question period 1 or 2 lectures ago. The Stoics held that all men, not only males or Greeks or philosophers, but all men have some share in reason. That all men are members of the same species, and that as such each individual has a certain metaphysical dignity and value, simply qua human and therefore potentially rational being. Every human being, they held, is to this extent entitled to respect as a human being, and politically he is entitled to equality before the law. All men in essence have certain rights, which others may not morally infringe. Slavery of any kind is wrong. And if they went on, the particular country you live in has laws decreeing that some men are second-class citizens or not citizens at all or are slaves. In other words, that some men have no rights. This is a violation of the proper principles of law, which should treat all men equally. Above the laws of the state, said the Stoics, there are the laws based on reality, the laws of nature, the so-called natural laws. And that was their major political contribution. The only proper country is a country in which the actual laws reflect the natural laws. And those natural laws are universal, applicable to all men, rational, absolute, eternal, unvarying, moral. If the laws of your country conflict with the natural laws, then the moral man is the man who gives his allegiance to the natural law, not to the law of his country. Now, the importance of these doctrines to the subsequent development of the theory of individual rights, constitutional government, and the United States of America can hardly be overemphasized. I don't think I need to emphasize this point because I think you can grasp its crucial importance. The Stoics do get the credit for being the first major school to grasp this cardinal political principle. I must add, however, that in their context it was deeply intertwined with their religious metaphysics and altruist ethics. Their basic grounds for asserting the metaphysical equality of men and the importance of what they called natural law, the basic grounds were not natural, but actually supernatural. All men are fragments of God, they reasoned. Therefore, all men are metaphysically brothers, in a literal sense. They're all offspring of the same divine Father. And it is because of this, and because God has ordained the natural laws, that all men should be treated equally. All men, as they put it, are members of one city, the cosmic city, the cosmopolis, get the idea, cosmopolitan? And hence all men have certain rights. And since they said your primary duty is to serve your brothers, you shouldn't enslave him, but live for him. You see, so there shouldn't be slaves. Now you see the terribly tragic mistaken mixture here. The basis of what later became an individualist politics, but tied to a supernaturalist metaphysics and an altruist ethics. And this mixture, of course, has subsisted to this day in the so-called conservative movement. Now, I trust that this audience knows the disaster of this combination, so I won't rehearse those points tonight. The fact, of course, is that a mystical defense of rights ultimately leads to the destruction of rights. In exactly the same way, for the same reasons as Plato's mystic defense of concepts ultimately led in modern philosophy, as we'll see, to the destruction of concepts. A mystic defense is worse than no defense. It is self-defeating. And, of course, that's the supernaturalism. As for the altruism, well, that I trust this audience understands fully, how it is incompatible with the principle of rights or of man's metaphysical equality. Here again, the Stoics represent the other side of the coin from the Sophists. They share the same basic view of egoist. The Sophists say the egoist tramples over others. The Stoics say, true enough, but you should be an altruist, sacrificing for others, and only in that way can you respect the rights of others. So altruism became tied to the defense of individual rights with disastrous results. Despite these terrible errors, however, the Stoics still do get credit for advancing the first germs of what was later to be a profoundly important political development.